Welcome, one and all. You're listening to What on Earth is Happening here on the Oracle Broadcasting Radio Network. I'm your host, Mark Passio. My website, whatonearthishappening.com. The network's website, oraclebroadcasting.com. Today is Sunday, December 2nd, 2012. The show is live every Sunday from 5 to 7 p.m. East Coast time. That's 4 to p.m. Central time. We have a good show lined up for you here today. We are going to be getting into a discussion on human psychopathy today on the show. What is a psychopath? What is psychopathy? What are the kinds of psychopathy? What are the characteristics of a true psychopath? What are the defenses against a psychopath? And I want to open up the phones later to talk about a dynamic that many people are loath to begin to talk about. At what point do you have to physically deal with a psychopath? I want to ask a question and open up the phones today for the listenership to ask, were the actions of the people who actually founded this country and had to physically beat back the British, had to physically take action against what was oppression against their natural inherent human rights? Was their actions what they felt they needed to do and then ultimately did an act of hate, or was that an act of love to that goal? Okay, so that having been said, the main topic of discussion for today is going to be psychopathy. We want to talk about what it is, and we want to talk about the types of psychopathy that exist. Now, the first thing I want to get out of the way here is I'm doing this show because I have brought up the concept, the idea, that there are many people who are completely resistant and are in psychological denial about the condition known as psychopathy. Now, this condition is now euphemized and has been termed sociopathy by medical professionals and healthcare professionals and mental health professionals. I feel that that's a softening of the term. They're basically the same condition, and sociopathy is simply a euphemism for the term psychopath. Some people say it more accurately describes the condition because it is someone who is basically breaking down the fabric of all of society, and it's a sociological, pathological condition. While that is true, I think it far too much de-emphasizes the psyche aspect of this disease, because the biggest problem of human psychopathy is not the first type, which we will be talking about, primary psychopathy. The biggest problem is secondary psychopathy. And as we make the distinguishment between these two different conditions, you will understand why the far larger problem in society is secondary psychopathy. Now, the denialists about this condition, people who want to try to put their head in the sand like a good new age little boy or little girl and stay in their condition of childish naivete, they don't want to believe that this condition exists at all. They don't want to believe that there is such a thing as primary psychopathy, that there is an inherent condition in humanity that is with us called primary psychopathy, and that exists from birth. This is too horrific for people to comprehend. And it's horrific for a number of reasons, which we're going to get to on this show, namely because of the implications of that fact. See, the implications that it forces one to look at and to recognize and to struggle with are far too uncomfortable for most people to deal with. So they'd rather put their head in the sand and pretend like it doesn't exist. And this is arguably more atrocious than the condition itself, the level of psychological denial that people are in, that there is a different if you will, species with us on this planet than just what we consider regular human beings. Because regular human beings have a capacity to experience human emotion, unlike a psychopath. That is a great part of what makes us truly human, being able to feel, being able to express emotion, being able to actually feel in the physiology as we take action, the repercussion of that action that we take with or upon someone else. A psychopath does not have that capability. Let me reemphasize that. It's not that a psychopath has numbed that, a true psychopath has numbed that capability out of themselves and is just suppressed. It's not there and never was there. We're talking about primary psychopathy. Primary psychopathy differs from secondary psychopathy in that the conditions, the characteristics are there from birth and are not generated by any conditional factors. It has nothing to do with environment. It has nothing to do with worldview. It has nothing to do with how they were brought up by their parents. It has nothing to do with the influences that they were around. A primary psychopath is born with an amputated capability, namely the ability to feel. For others, they cannot feel. They cannot empathize with others. That ability is not present at all. And this is because of a degradation in the brain. It is actual brain damage. And this is one of the reasons I find it so difficult for people to believe that certain people can be born with brain damage. I mean, different brain damage conditions happen at birth. This happens all the time. Maybe conditions in the womb contribute to the malformation of certain characteristics of the brain. One thing I want to emphasize is I'm not a neuroscientist, nor am I a medical doctor, but the whole point is that I've put a great deal of study into the condition of psychopathy. And even more so than that, I have really truly sat down and wrestled with the question of why it exists at all. Why is it here? Why does this exist? And those implications are why most people want to run away from this issue and don't want to talk about it. They don't want to truly understand that humanity is not here alone. We're here with a different form of animal than us. Something that is far less than human. They see themselves as greater than human because they look at the conscience as any kind of a moral code as being something that holds them back from doing what they really want to do in life, no matter who it hurts. But the truly discerning and those who truly have some wisdom will recognize that a primary psychopath is something that has something that is, they are something that is far less than a true human being. They have an amputated capability that a true human possesses, and the psychopath lacks. It's like being born, primary psychopathy is like being born without arms. Okay, the capability to manipulate objects with hands isn't there because you don't have hands. That's it. It doesn't matter how much you want to develop it. It doesn't matter, who could show you, how to have dexterity with the hands. You don't have that physiological mechanism to engage that task at all. So a secondary psychopath is completely different than a primary psychopath. The characteristics, which we're going to list in a few moments, are the same, but they were created over time. They weren't born like that. Secondary psychopathy means you weren't born like that. You have the physiological mechanism to experience emotion, but it has been numbed out through trauma, through abuse, through conditioning, through a poisoned worldview. So we have to understand that there are two types of psychopathy, primary and secondary. And let's just look at the word psychopath so we even get a clearer definition of what it is. Psychopathy. Okay, psyche in Greek means the mind. And one of the things I want to also tell people is I didn't prepare slides for today's show. I want to get people really to look at the ideas here, the concepts, to really deeply understand without absolutely any distraction. Perhaps I will add some slides for this show in the future and put them on the podcast to just break down some words and things like that, and maybe point out the areas of the brain again to people. We've covered that extensively on the show, but perhaps I'll make a slide or two or three just to as a review to go with the podcast. But to go back to what I was talking about, secondary psychopathy is a created condition created by the conditioning factors, the environmental factors that the person has undergone in their life, worldview, impressioning by other people, circumstances and events that have taken place to them in their life that have colored their conditions. But again, what we're talking about here is, if we look at it from an etymological point of view, the word psychopathy means sickness of the psyche or sickness of the mind. This is a mental condition. The word psyche in Greek means mind, and pathos in Greek, this is the word that we get pathological or pathology from. Illness, sickness, okay? A depression of the mind. Something that has suppressed the true self, the higher self. And this is what a great deal of humanity is actually suffering from, the condition of secondary psychopathy. The numbers of secondary psychopaths are far, far, far greater, far in excess of primary psychopaths. Primary psychopaths, the number is debated amongst clinical psychologists and clinical psychiatrists. The different numbers are kicked around, and some of them will push the number as high as up to 4% of the human population, which I've always felt is drastically overinflated. Drastically. I don't feel that the number of primary, or in other words, born psychopaths, and yes, there is such a thing as a born psychopath, I don't put that number as anything higher than 1%, and that's a guesstimation. What I would call a well-educated guess, but nonetheless, I wouldn't say it's definitively that number, but I would think it's something less than that. I think if it's 0.5%, that's a lot. And, different people will argue the number. I don't think the number is what is important. I think the understanding of the difference between a primary and secondary psychopath is very important. And I think understanding the characteristics of a psychopath to know what we're dealing with. You have to understand what the enemy is. And yes, there is an enemy. The New Age movement that wants to tell you that these people are not the enemy of humanity are frauds and charlatans, quite frankly. Real simply, that's what these people are. These New Agers who want to tell you that, oh, no, they're just ill. They're not, that has nothing to do with the problem humanity is experiencing. They don't want to admit these people are in control of humanity. They're running all of the social institutions that humanity believes in and continues to support and prop up. And they're at the highest levels of all of them. Primary psychopaths are. And they have their horde of secondary psychopaths doing their bidding. And people are still in denial of this condition and still totally ignorant of it. Excuse me, they're ignorant of it. Let's get the pronunciation of that word right. I'm going to stop using the pronunciation ignorant and totally condition myself to constantly saying they are ignorant because of the emphasis of ignore. The population who would say, oh, we don't want bad conditions here amongst humanity. We want to prosper, we want to thrive, we want to have true freedom, etc. These are the very people who are ignorant of the actual condition that exists in their midst. They don't want to look at it because it makes them uncomfortable. Oh, we don't want to look at the negative. God forbid. You might learn something. And you might be able to come up with a strategy to protect yourself. And you might know when it's time to actually physically rebel against captors that have no right to do what they're doing. So let's look at what a psychopath actually is. What is this condition? What is this sickness of the mind that we're talking about? This illness, this mental illness that, unfortunately, while I don't want it to be the case, that's irrelevant what I want to be. All of our suffering is generated from us refusing to accept that which is and then dealing with it. It doesn't matter what I want. Of course, I don't want psychopathy to exist, but it does. It is real. It does exist in the world. And being ignorant of that fact isn't going to change the conditions that are being perpetuated by the psychopaths of this world, because they are the enemy of humanity. And this evil does exist here, and it is real, and yes, it is evil. And that's why people want to ignore it. They want to ignore it because they would have to wrestle with the one overarching, all-powerful question called why. That's the question they don't want to look at. That's the question they don't want to deal with. They don't want to look at the why. Because if you start wrestling with that question, you open up a huge can of worms, and it will extend into the things we're going to start getting into here on What on Earth is Happening. That question of why does this condition exist here with humanity at all? And we're going to enter some speculative realms in future shows. Maybe I'll have to temporarily call the show What on Earth May Very Well Be Happening, because none of us have definitive proof about some of the speculations we may cover in the future on future shows here. Up to this point, I've dealt with facts, things that I can confirm definitively do exist and are happening here on Earth. But when it comes to psychopathy, we're talking about something that has been with us since time immemorial, prehistory, the ancient past, the dawn of human antiquity. And a lot of that knowledge of what happened during that time period is lost to humanity because of different cataclysmic events and deliberate purgings of information that have occurred in the ancient past. So we need to get out of our ignorance when it comes to this condition. Everyone should understand this condition and its characteristics. And everyone should also have an understanding that you have a right, a natural inherent right to defend yourself. I'm talking even about the lowercase s self in this instance, your physical self, from the influence of psychopaths and how they want to manipulate society. You have an inherent right to physically defend yourself against these animals, because that's what they are. A psychopath is not really a human being. A psychopath has all of the characteristics, as we're going to list here, as an animal. In their behavior, they are no different than any animal, any vicious, brutal animal that may attack you in the wild. So for all intents and purposes, they are not human beings. Try to rationalize that however you wish. You can go and do all the kinds of mental gymnastics that you want to just try to see these people as sick. Okay? Now, the secondary psychopath is sick. They can be reformed. And we have to continuously make this distinction. There are those that can be helped, and then there are those who are simply come into the world broken. There is a tiny fraction of people that are born like that. Now, if you didn't have their influence, if you didn't have people allowing them to grow up and not isolating them, not containing their influence, right? If there were so many people that would be willing to contain their influence because they knew about this condition and they were on guard, on vigilance, and defending against it, then these people wouldn't be such a problem. They would be negligible. Because they would be telling people, hey, do my bidding, do this, do that. And people would say, you're sick. That would be the immediate response. I know that you're sick, you're broken, you're something other than what we are. You're not really human, truly. You're just a broken computer that somehow did not get infused with the capability that other humans are infused with. And no, I'm not going to listen to one thing you have to say because you are just the influence of evil in the world amongst us. That's it. But too many people are willing to follow them, to do their bidding, to follow their orders, to accept money in return for the evil acts that they tell people to go and commit. And so we do it to ourselves, for them. And that's done through secondary psychopaths, their horde, as I call them. The horde of the primary psychopaths, who are really in control. They give orders down to their horde of other animals that have the capability of becoming human, whereas the primary psychopath does not. And they issue these commands, and then these other pseudo-animals called secondary psychopaths that just follow orders carry out their commands and do their evil for them. So what are the characteristics of all psychopaths, whether they be primary, meaning that they are simply born like that? Those are the actual broken computers. The body computer is broken, is damaged. They come into the world inflicted with a virus that cannot be purged from the system. That's it. And again, I don't care who's unwilling to believe that. That's the way it is, and it's the way it has been. Really, it's the way it has been since we've been here. That this tiny percentage has always existed among humanity. And again, then we get to the implication of that fact. Why? Why has there always been this influence here among us, this condition, this other species, if you will, that looks and sounds like a human being, but is not a human being? Why? We're going to talk about that. Maybe on future shows we'll address that question. That may be several shows. But let's look at what psychopathy actually is, its characteristics, the personality traits and characteristics of a psychopath, whether they be primary or secondary. A genetic psychopath, or in other words, one that is a psychopath from birth, created that way, made that way from birth, or one that has been influenced to become a psychopath, which is called secondary psychopathy, through conditions, worldview poisoning, external factors in life, buying into certain fundamental axioms and belief systems, etc. So here are the characteristics. Aggressiveness. Okay, that's number one. They are willing to engage the aggression principle, which is basically attack even if they have not been attacked. Initiation of violence, in other words, is something that they're willing to do to have their way. Callousness, total disregard for the feelings of others. Doesn't matter what amount of suffering they cause for others. They don't care. They don't care how it makes you feel. They don't care that it does harm to you. The complete absence of conscience. no conscience. Perhaps that should be better stated as the complete absence of the exercise of conscience. A psychopath may even in their own intellect know whether an action is right or wrong, but they don't care. They'll do the wrong. They'll willfully choose the wrong over the right if it means more for them and them getting a tactical advantage and power over someone else. A complete absence of empathy. No regard for the feelings of other human beings. If they're being harmed, if they're being hurt, doesn't matter. I'll do it anyway. We're already seeing that this is a big bulk of human behavior. This can account for a whole lot of the way people act, a whole huge portion of humanity, the way they act. This is also the characteristics of just about every institution on the face of the earth that you could possibly imagine or think of. Banking, education, corporations, medical industry in many respects. They claim to be people of care, when in fact, it's all about the pharmaceuticals, you know? It's all about making as much money as we can reel in on sickness. Government. So, more characteristics of the psychopath. Cunning thinking, a very sharp, cunning intellect. Not holistic intelligence, but left brain intellect. These are intellectual people, but they're not truly intelligent. They don't have holistic intelligence because they lack the right brain aspects of consciousness. And we're going to talk about the physiological mechanisms that actually are responsible for, bringing forth these characteristics in an individual. What part of the brain is malfunctioning? What part of this body computer that we call the brain and the central nervous system and the physical body, what part of it is broken? And what conditions does that create in the personality and the psyche of the individual? Another characteristic of psychopathy is a willingness to engage in strongly immoral conduct, even criminal conduct, to get one's way. See, these are willful individuals' willingness to engage in strongly immoral and criminal conduct, if necessary. So they have intellect plus will, but what's missing is the spirit. The sacred feminine is gone. It's missing. The emotions aren't there. The emotional system, the developed emotional system of the human being. I shouldn't even say human being. In the secondary psychopath, yes, they're still a human being. The primary psychopath is, again, a different animal. You want to speculate about what that animal may be, why it may be among us, go right ahead. But the conditions are the same. They have a strong intellect, very sharp, keen, cunning intellect, and a very strong will. But the emotional development is stunted from birth. They don't have the normal range of human emotional capacity. And therefore, that makes them, for all intents and purposes, not human. It's a different species than human beings. When whatever genetic factors and conditions come together to create the material for this being in the womb, and you could even speculate perhaps womb trauma may have something to do with this, the conditions of the development of the fetus in the womb. I'm willing to open up the floor to tons of speculation when it comes to this condition. Scientists don't really know truly where psychopathy came from. But again, that problem, that speculative problem, is why so many people don't want to look at it, because they don't want to wrestle with the implications. More characteristics to be listed. The willingness to take what they want and do as they please at any time, regardless of who is hurt or who is wronged. Willingness to take what they want. Theft isn't a problem for them. They'll take your right to remain safe. They'll take your right to remain unharmed. They'll take your right not to be stolen from. They'll take your property. They'll take your rights. They'll take your freedom. They'll take your life if necessary. They're takers. A psychopath is a taker. They don't care who they have to hurt to take more. More is their only goal because they operate in the reptilian brain. With the left brain, the left hemisphere of the neocortex totally overactive, completely chronically overengaged. Those are the only two parts of the brain that are really truly working properly in the psychopath, the R complex and the left brain. The right brain, almost nothing happening. You put a true psychopath into a high-tech brain scan, like a SPECT scan or a PET scan or something like that. You looked at the right brain hemisphere. The neural activity in the right brain and in the prefrontal cortex as a whole is going to be almost non-existent or significantly diminished. And you can do this online. Go look at the brain scans of a psychopath. Maybe I'll post a couple of them with the podcast as well. You'll be amazed at how different it is from a normally functioning human being, because it's not a human being's brain. It's some other thing. It's some other animal, an automaton robot animal that looks, breathes, talks, walks like a human being, but is not a human being. And I know people will say, oh, those are strong words, Mark. You're saying that there are people here among us that aren't really human. Yes, I am. Absolutely saying that. Because it's true. These people are broken irrevocably, the primary psychopath. They aren't human, and they're never going to be human, ever, ever, ever. They cannot be reformed. There's a reason for this, and we'll get into that. We need to focus our attention on attempting to reform secondary psychopaths. And see, herein lies the problem. You have to know. You'd have to have a case history. You'd have to have examples from their youth that their parents are maybe perhaps willing to bring forward. You'd have to talk to a psychopath's parents. Were they always like this, or did they become like this over time? What kind of behavioral characteristics did they display as a child? You know what a great television series that is an allegory about all of this. It's called Dexter. I highly encourage people to watch this television show. If you don't watch any other television, download this series off of BitTorrent or Usenet or something like that and watch it. Because this is what it's all about, psychopathy. And this particular or maybe possibly not born psychopath, but one who became a secondary psychopath very young in life, decides to deal with the other psychopaths of the world. That's all I'll say. I don't want to ruin the premise for people. It's basically a serial killer who only kills other killers. That's what the show is about, based on books that were written. I believe by the author's name is Jeff Lindsay. But to go back to the characteristics of the psychopath, we have to understand that it doesn't matter to them who they hurt or wrong. They're going to continue with their actions because they have a very developed intellect and a very developed will. They're not going to back down. Psychopaths don't back down. They become like robots that are programmed to do a particular action. So do secondary psychopaths. They operate the same way. It's like a robot. You're not really, when they're still in that condition, you're not dealing with a real human being. You're dealing with an animal robot that is programmed with code, just like a computer is programmed. Getting, angry about the actual condition or ignoring it, it would be the same. It would be the equivalent of getting angry at the way a computer program actually then executes its code. Forget about getting angry with it. You got to deal with it. Either you go into the code and you change the code, or you still get the same result. And for a secondary psychopath, it is possible to change that code with enough work on the individual. Now, with a primary psychopath, at some point, yes, if we developed advanced enough technology, and we could talk about that in a little while, would it be possible to develop a mechanism for dealing with primary psychopathy? We could speculate on what that technological solution or genetic solution might look like. Okay? But I'll put that off to the side for a moment. Let's get back to the characteristics. Psychopaths all have a deceptive ability to appear to others as being benevolent, as being the good guys, as being caring. And this is what they don't want you to realize. The psychopath is only effective as long as they are concealed. They have to remain hidden. Once their work and their personality traits are brought out into the light of day, game over for them. Because then people are going to be aware of what they're truly dealing with. And unfortunately, right now, they're not. They're not aware of it. So beware of people that are, excessively charming, appearing outwardly benevolent, but really they have a hidden agenda. And they'll never tell you about this possibility, that they'll never talk about psychopathy. They're the people who would want to ignore this most of all. Forget about bringing that forward and putting that on the table as a topic of discussion. They don't want anybody looking into this. They want this condition well concealed and hidden. And they want people to think of it only as a medical condition that is just dealt with at a, psychological or psychiatric level. When in fact, these people are not only all around us, they are in the highest levels of all worldly institutions, running things in positions of quote unquote responsibility. But it's not responsibility, it's control. They're in positions of control. The psychopath has a deceptive ability to behave in superficially charming ways. That's what you have to keep in mind. Superficially charming ways, but that's only to get people's guards to go down so that they can continue to advance their hidden motives. They have ulterior hidden motives and agendas that they will do anything to get forward. And to make the public off guard, to take their guard down, they have to charm you. They have to make you think they're out for their self-interests. This is what all politicians do. They need to make you think you need them most of all. They have a total willingness to use intimidation and violence to control others. That's no problem for them. We have to kill how many people in order to get our agenda through? 3,000. No problem. Do it. That's it. Just like that. Just like that. Snap of a finger. And people don't think that people like that exist in the world because they make a fundamental mistake. They try to graft on or attribute their moral sensibilities onto someone else. And you can't do that. You cannot make the erroneous and dangerous assumption that in a given situation, other people will make the moral decision that you would make. People will say, oh, they wouldn't do that. When in reality, what they're really thinking in their own mind is, I wouldn't do that. And then they're transferring that psychological transference onto another. And they're making the erroneous assumption that they wouldn't do that. And that, again, as I said at the beginning of the show, that is the naivete of a child. The naivete of an innocent child. And that's a bad form of innocence in this case. Because we need to get street smart. when it comes to dealing with a psychopath. And again, the psychopaths are in control of all the institutions on the earth. Government, military, police. This is who we're talking about. They are the psychopaths. Bankers, people in education, even people in the New Age movement, alternative religions, and religious institutions themselves, covering up sex crimes for pedophiles, pederasts. They're psychopaths in religion. They're willing to violate anybody's inherent human rights. Rights? Forget rights. Your life doesn't mean anything to them. You think your rights mean anything to them? What right and wrong means nil, zilch, nothing. Because if you just go back and take note of everything I've been saying, aggressiveness, absence of conscience, absence of empathy, cunning thinking, okay, strong will, willingness to violate others with, by initiating force and violence. Every one of these things is animal behavior. Every one of these things is descriptive of how an animal behaves. And people still want to believe in their childish naivete that these people are actually human. You don't want to believe that there's another species here with us, amongst us. Again, it's pure wishful thinking. It's psychological denial. It's cognitive dissonance. And most of all, it's unhealthy, childish naivete. More characteristics. The psychopath has willingness to intentionally violate the inherent human rights of others. They have the complete absence of any sense of guilt or remorse. I mean, if they have the willingness to go and violate people's rights and even take their lives if necessary, you think they have any remorse or feel any guilt for what they do? They feel nothing. They feel nothing except the motivation to acquire more and more and more, regardless of at whose expense it may happen to be. Because that's what a reptile does. That's what an animal does. That's an animal's behavior, not a human behavior, an animal behavior. And before we even get any further into speculation on the part of people thinking that they understand what this is not what human nature is, ladies and gentlemen. I want to emphasize that right now, but I'm going to go over that again a little bit later. This is not the nature of the human being. This may be the nature of a tiny, 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 tiny fraction of humanity, but it is not human nature, quote unquote, human nature. To think of this in that sense is such distortion and worldview poisoning and sickness of the mind itself that's what's keeping us under the control of the psychopath, is to think that's how human nature is, and that's just the way it's always going to be. And that's the thing, that line of thinking, that line of distorted reasoning is actually what allows them to keep controlling the bulk of humanity. Because people have that poisoned worldview, well, that's just the way it is. That's just human nature. No, it is not at all what human nature is. This is a condition that exists within the human genome, for reasons which we can speculate on later, that happens to be present and ultimately simply needs to be dealt with. Whether we try to figure out a way to get rid of it from the genome, whether we try to figure a way to mimic human emotion through technology and use technology for the purpose of, essentially building some kind of apparatus to make these people be able to feel, and that would be a positive use of implantation of technology into the body, or using technology in such a way to again, through algorithms and software, mimic the complexity of human emotion and then integrate that with the biophysiology of this small, tiny class of people. But again, that's, a speculation and an argument that we could talk about another time. I want to continue to focus on the characteristics. So we talked about that they have no sense of guilt or remorse at all. Zero. They don't care. They just don't care. They have no care for other people. They want other people not to care so that they can actually create this pecking order of them ruling the roost, and then all of the secondary psychopaths that they created to be like them, doing their bidding for them. Rationalization is another one of their things. Justification, in other words. They're willing to justify and rationalize away their own immoral behavior to create rights for them that don't exist in nature. Justification. Deference, psychological deference, is another one of the characteristics of this condition. That's making constant attempts to lay blame upon someone else for your own conduct. Passing the buck, so to speak. Oh, I did this because this person did that. I behave like this. Transference, deference. Psychological denial is another part of the condition of psychopathy itself. You're denying your own outright wrongdoing, not claiming any responsibility for your own actions. That's not my fault, Oh, it caused tons and tons of harm to other people, and it was a direct result of what I did, but I bear no moral responsibility for it. I'm not responsible. Utter denial, utter contemptuousness for the feelings of other beings. Contempt. They look at people with a conscience in contempt. You're lower than me. You're less than me. And you could say, hey, you're doing the same thing. Yeah, I am. I'm saying these people really are the ones without completeness. They are the ones who do truly lack something that other people have. The ability to feel. Again, they look at that as a detriment that they're pleased not to be burdened with. Oh, I'm so pleased not to be burdened with the ability to feel anything in the physiology as a result of my behavior. Therefore, I'm unrestrained. I can do whatever I want, no matter who it harms. Why wouldn't I want to be like that? That makes me better than somebody else. Wrong. It makes you infinitely less. Actually incapable of even perceiving the entire purpose of human existence, which is to develop the essence of the spirit, and that's only possible through the gift of human emotion. That's only possible through the heart. And again, I'm saying things that are going to be harsh and unapologetic and things that people do not want to deal with. They don't want to bring up, they don't want to acknowledge them, they don't want to talk about them because they're in denial themselves. The people who don't want to look at this condition are in cognitive dissonance, high-level psychological denial. And that's a mental illness in and of itself. Back to the characteristics. Pathological lying. Boy, does that sound familiar. That goes hand in hand with psychopathy. Pathological lying. Again, every one of the leaders of every institution on the face of the earth comes to mind. Politicians, people in government, people in banking, high financiers, every corporation on the face of the earth. They lie pathologically to get what they want, or to manipulate other people into doing what they want them to do. They don't care. They have no allegiance to truth, no care for the truth a bit. They'll say or do anything without concern for accuracy, without concern for truth, in order to advance their agenda. They have a totally distorted sense of the consequences of their actions. They think they can continue to do things and get away with them endlessly. The consequence for my behavior, that's rubbish. That's some religious rubbish. That's what a true psychopath thinks. When somebody is on the verge of psychopathy, secondary psychopathy, okay, primary psychopaths just think there's no consequence for anything they do. They can continue to do things and get away with them forever. That's part of their distorted logic process. But you talk to a person who's even beginning to develop secondary psychopathy, happening here on the Oracle Broadcasting Radio Network. I'm your host, Mark Passio. My website, whatonearthishappening.com. We're talking about human psychopathy. What is a psychopath? What are their identifying personality characteristics? What is the difference between primary and secondary psychopathy? And at a future point, we'll look at speculation on why psychopathy even exists at all. That'll be for another time. I want to get back into the identifying characteristics of psychopathy. We talked about pathological lying. We talked about a severely distorted sense of the consequences of their own behavior, of their own actions. Now, here's another one is the total failure to accept any personal responsibility. Okay, that goes hand in hand with the distorted sense of the consequences of their own behavior. They have a strong belief that they'll never be brought to justice. Okay, contempt for other people, for their will to do anything about it. They think they'll continue to abuse others endlessly and no one will ever do anything about it. And let me just emphatically state this here on the air under no uncertain terms. They are wrong. Very wrong. Just so that is stated for the record, you're incorrect about that. They will be brought to justice. And I would like to see them brought to justice here in the physical domain. Regardless, they're going to be brought to justice, one way or another. But I think we should bring them to justice. The people who do truly have the ability and the capacity to feel and to know right from wrong and to know truth. I feel that's our responsibility. We have an ability to respond to this condition. And it would be right for us to respond to it. It would be right for us to do what is necessary to purge this condition from humanity once and for all. And I think we need to do that by working with people who are either in or on the borderline of secondary psychopathy constantly, in a one-to-one basis if necessary, or in a group setting if necessary, to bring them in some form out of this cult that they're a member of that keeps them psychopathic, regardless of what institution it is: military, police, government, banking, etc. Education, medicine. These are all cults. For all intents and purposes, they are operational cults that only care about their own continuation, the continuation of their own existence, their own survival. And all they're doing is continuing to condition people to get them to comply behaviorally with the factors that are necessary for the institution's survival, regardless of who is being harmed in the process. And that's more characteristics of a psychopath. The survival of themselves and their agenda is paramount to everything else. That's the number one tenet of all dark occultism. Satanism, dark Luciferianism, the number one agenda. Satanism, dark Luciferianism, dark Kabbalism, dark Masonry, Every one of these things, the number one thing is self-preservation above all else. Survival. No matter who needs to be harmed in the process, I go forward. Whether I'm doing what's right or wrong or not. If I'm doing what's wrong, it doesn't make a difference. Regardless of what has to be done, I go forward, and self-preservation is my highest instinct, which again is an animal instinct. That's not, people think, oh, that's human instinct, that's human nature. No, that's animal instinct. That's animal nature. And people will say, well, human beings are just another animal. There's where you're wrong again. Human beings are not just another animal. Human beings are an animal with a capacity to grow to so much more than that base animalistic nature, because we have more than one type of nature. There is an animal nature that dwells within us, but that doesn't have to rule. We have to develop a true human nature. And people confuse that with our condition. Nature and condition are not the same thing. We need to develop true human nature. The current human condition has nothing to do with human nature. It has to do with animal nature that is ruling the human condition. I hope people can grasp that and grasp what I just said to you. Really sit and think about it. So, one characteristic I haven't gotten to is perhaps the most important, okay? Psychopaths have the ability to fake the normal human emotions, even though they're not really feeling them. This is because they grew up with this condition. A primary psychopath grew up with this condition. When they were young, they interacted with people and recognized very early in life that they were different, drastically different than other people. And they knew that if they were exposed as being completely different, they would be recognized for being something that is less than human. Or in other words, being a full animal, having no true human nature, looking as a human, having the guise of a human, being able to walk, breathe, talk, like a human being, but really not being human. They recognized they were something other than a normal human being. Another species, if you will. And in order to go through life unrecognized, to hide in plain sight, if you will, they became very, very good actors. They watched normal human emotion at displays of normal emotion in context in society, and then practice that, literally practice it, to try to fake it. And, I would go so far as to say, if you're thinking, well, what did they do? Stand in front of a mirror and actually practice different emotional responses? Yes. They actually did that and may still actually do that. They practice literally to try to make their responses as genuine seeming as possible, when in fact, in the heart, they feel nothing. In the body, there is no physiological response going on, and there's a reason for that. The part of the brain that actually generates the ability for the physiology to feel emotional responses in the body when certain conditions are present, when certain situations are taking place, that part of the brain that puts those neuropeptides and neurotransmitters into the bloodstream, okay, is not functioning properly in the psychopath. And in the case of the primary psychopath, that part of the brain is actually broken from birth. It is not functioning. This is the limbic brain. The midbrain, the middle chamber, as it is called in the esoteric sense, is not functioning. Now, we could speculate about why that's the case, but in the case of the primary psychopath, it's important simply to understand that that condition exists from birth. In a secondary psychopath, the same basic thing is taking place, but it is because the being, through their conditioning and through their bad choices, okay, and not working with the brain, not working with the psyche, not doing psychic cleansing to clean and maintain sanity, sanitized conditions within the psyche, okay, that part of the brain has atrophied. The midbrain has actually atrophied. And the R complex of the brain is actually ruling the individual. And this also happens because the left brain is chronically overengaged, and the right brain, creative thinking, heuristic thinking, in other words, big picture thinking, has not been engaged. Somebody has only focused on individual physical tasks, everyday physical tasks that they need to do for, whoa, here's the word here, survival. That's all they've been focused on. They haven't been focused on any abstract thinking. They haven't been focused on anything creative. Music hasn't been a part of their life. Art hasn't been a part of their life. They're only about money. I need money to survive, so I got to do this physical task to survive, and that's all my entire existence is about. That's the path to becoming a psychopath. A secondary psychopath. I want to constantly reemphasize the difference between the two. You have to get clear about the difference, that a secondary psychopath is created through conditions and factors in life. In other words, the culture creates the secondary psychopath. The culture that they're in, the cult that they're in, that they're identified with, that they believe in unquestioningly. You can break them outside of the cult, sure, then you can change the thought patterning and conditioning that created the secondary psychopathic condition. I don't care what you do with a primary psychopath. You are not going to change their condition because they are, let's, for all intents and purposes, call them a midbrain amputee. The midbrain is there. It's just broken. It's like, look, it's like if you put, put a component in a computer that doesn't really function in the computer. There's no driver for it, okay? You put a video card in a computer and you don't have any driver for that card, it doesn't make a difference. You could plug a screen in. You're not going to have the manifestation on the screen because while the driver may be present, which is what we're talking about in the while the physical card may be present in the computer, which is what we're talking about the midbrain, if you don't have a driver, I don't care what's going to happen. When you turn on the computer, I don't care if there's a card in there. I don't care if you have the nicest monitor. You're not going to display an image because the driver isn't there. So for all intents and purposes, the functioning between the software and the hardware is broken. That's what a primary psychopath is. So therefore, again, you can speculate about, well, what might we do to solve this condition? That's even if you don't want to wrestle with what put it that way to begin with. You know, like I said, you might find what created that problem in the genome and correct it at an atomic level if we ever get to that advanced level of genetic understanding. Maybe that would work. Maybe you could, again, build some kind of a biofeedback device for the physiology that mimics through software and algorithms the normal range of emotions. And I'm totally against putting any technology in the body. I have no transhumanist leanings. I don't want to see anything, like that done to normal human beings. But again, technology exists for a reason, and this what I would look at as a possible positive use of technology that operates with the physiology. Look, bionic limbs for people who may be an amputee, I don't have a problem with that. That's not wrong. That's the positive use of an advanced technology. Okay, if you're going to give someone a functionality that is there that they're lacking and suffering as a result of not having there, then fine, do it. And I'm saying this would only be necessary for a tiny, 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 tiny fraction of the bulk of humanity. I'm not saying that all the people who are currently psychopathic would need, any kind of a technology put into them to correct that condition. That's not what I'm saying. So don't get it twisted. Okay, I'm saying for the person who is the amputee from birth, the primary psychopath, you're not going to solve this by working with the individual. You're not going to even solve it by changing the conditions they live in. You can go and take a primary psychopath and put them in a Tibetan Buddhist ashram and have them chant with the Buddhist monks until the day they die. They're still going to be a primary psychopath. They're not going to feel anything as a result of that. It's irrevocably broken. The midbrain of a primary psychopath, barring any kind of physical intervention or interaction through technology, is irrevocably broken and never going to generate human emotion in their physiology. Get over it. Get over it. That's the case. That's true. That exists among us. The end. If you're in denial of that, you yourself have a psychological condition called cognitive dissonance. You don't want to look at what reality actually is. You're ignoring reality, thinking you're going to somehow prosper in that condition, which is a psychological pathology itself. So understand the difference. The primary psychopath has the actual midbrain. There's no driver driving it. Therefore, there is no ability for them to feel. So if humanity got technologically advanced enough maybe to write a driver, quote unquote, maybe we could help those people. But right now, we're not at that level of technological expertise and know-how. Because to be able to write an algorithmic program that would be able to mimic the full range of human emotions would probably take more supercomputing power than all the computers on the earth multiplied by 1,000 times. That's how complex interaction with, the interaction of human emotion actually is. And maybe that's not the point of trying to solve it that way. Maybe the point is that these people just need to be identified and mitigated. They need to be dealt with. They need to be isolated. I would prefer them just being here and being a mild annoyance, and every once in a while when they raise one of their ridiculous, immoral notions, people just brush them off because they're at such a level of higher consciousness, and they say, "You are mad and sick. I feel bad for you that you were born like that, but go away now." And they would be no problem if people as a whole came out of their mock or secondarily psychopathic conditions, started actually caring, healed their own worldview, and decided we're not going to do the bidding of the primary psychopathic animals that are here running things. And that's wishful thinking in many ways, because are there enough people to counteract the psychopath, the primary psychopath? I would say not even close, folks. And if you think there is, I would also say you're pretty delusional, and you're probably on a very new age, bent in life, and you think that things are much, much, much more promising or positive than what they really are. I tend to look at things as a realist and not try to put my hopes and projections on what's really happening, but instead of actually look at what actually is happening, what actually is occurring, hence the name of the show. What on earth is happening, not what on earth I want to be happening. Deal with the reality, the truth as it is, and then make a decision, what are you going to do about it? So one of the things that people have termed psychopaths is an interspecies predator. And it's somewhat accurate, but in many ways, I wouldn't even use the term interspecies predator. I would simply refer to them as a different species that's preying on humanity. Okay? They lack the actual qualities that allow for human beings as a body of people to live in social harmony. As long as these people are running things, there will never be peace. There will never be social harmony in humanity. This is the problem. And the problem is that we continue to let them rule, that we won't say no to them. The problem is that there's a whole nother subspecies of, a subsection of humanity that is doing the bidding of the primary psychopathic animal that is ruling over the body of humanity. They're saying, yes, animal psychopath, I'll do your bidding for you. What do you have for me? You have a nice paycheck for me? Oh, great, I can get my widescreen television. I can get my house out in the suburbs with a 3-car garage and a Lexus. Great. I'll destroy my own people and their future for you, for this other species. I just need a big enough number in my bank account. Let's go. Let's start the work. Unfortunately, that's the animalistic nature that most human beings display. They don't care. They don't care. They're so jaded and they've become so lowered in consciousness through all the food they take in, through all the poisonous media that they watch, the poison worldview that they've taken into themselves, the horrible things that they're willing to listen to come out of other idiots' mouths that has nothing to do with reality. Trivia, inane banter, sports, nonsense, entertainment that has nothing to do with allegory or morals. And there's a few things out there that do, try to put the moral tale in with the entertainment. It's a desperate attempt to get people to comprehend allegory, to be entertained by something and then, oh, whoa, I see what he was saying there. It works on so few people. It's not enough. That's not doing enough, folks. It works on too few. I'm not knocking allegorical fiction. I personally love it. But the bulk of humanity is not getting the message. They don't understand something like Dexter. They don't grasp what's being said. They don't understand something like Lord of the Rings or Star Wars or Harry Potter or, The Walking Dead, another show that's highly allegorical. Because they're the Walking Dead themselves. How are they going to comprehend what's really being said in an allegory? You need a certain amount of brain development. You need a certain amount of psychological development to even grasp what an allegory is, let alone what it's saying to you. So, an interspecies predator is how many people have viewed the psychopath. I, again, almost look at them as an extra-species predator. They're outside of the real humanity. They're not really truly human. There's something else altogether that looks human, but is not. The condition of psychopathy is at the root of the problems in which we find ourselves, and very few people are even talking about it. I talked about a quote on the last couple of radio shows that I was on, that there are more people in the world, adults living in the world, that would rather believe in Santa Claus, that would rather condition their mind to continue to believe in Santa Claus, okay, than there are people who are willing to turn their attention and deal with the reality of psychopathy, particularly primary psychopathy. And there's a reason for that. And not only just to recognize that it exists, but to recognize that it actually, that the primary psychopaths are who is actually ruling humanity as our masters. More people would rather believe in Santa Claus than address that truth. The main reason for that is they would have to wrestle with the uncomfortable implication of why does this condition exist in the first place? And again, I said we'll get into that. Not for today's show, however. I want to go back to a couple more things regarding the psychopath, and then I want to pose a question and open up the phone lines. Psychopathy is not human nature, as some people would lead people to believe. This is just not how people are. Don't be misled into that. Don't be misled by the opposite. The New Age movement doesn't want people to look into this or focus on it, to learn more about it. They don't want you to understand this is who's ruling you, because they're responsible largely for putting a lot of the New Age material into existence, this cult of psychopaths. So, it's very dangerous to ignore this. You ignore it at your own peril and at the peril of your own family, your own freedom, the peril of your own freedom and the freedom of your own family and loved ones. But the opposite, to think that this is human nature, is also just as dangerous and poisonous. Again, tiny, tiny portion of humanity has this in them as a genetic psychological condition, because the midbrain is basically operating without a driver. That's how you can look at the analogy. It's there, but the driver is missing. The software code to actually activate that midbrain is not working properly. You could look at it as not there at all, or maybe infected with a virus. However you want to look at it to make you understand the concept, is fine. Okay, so psychopathy is not just a psychological disorder. This is the other thing that we have to learn. It is not just a psychological disorder. It is also a learned behavior. Primary psychopathy is a psychological disorder that is inherent in the human genome. But secondary psychopathy is a learned behavior. You can actually acquire it over time by taking in the worldview of the primary psychopath. It is a communicable disease as such. It is able to be transferred from the diseased psyche of one person over some time to create disease or pathology in the psyche of another individual. And that's what a communicable disease is. Yeah, it's not an airborne symptom. It's an energy-borne symptom. It is an ether-borne disease. It's not an airborne disease, it's ether-borne. The psychopaths are putting their worldview out into the field of energy around us, and we're latching onto it and taking it on board ourselves, and it's infecting our psyche. So they'll tell you, psychopathy cannot be caught. Yes, it can be caught. It just happens over a long period of time by taking in a diseased worldview as your own. So it is a communicable disease. Again, the psychopath's ability to remain hidden rests with their ability to feign a normal range of human emotions. And that's what allows them to stay well hidden in the places that they operate. Once enough light is cast in their direction, exposing them and their agenda, more people, become wise to their ways, to their methods of manipulation. And eventually, when that's done, a psychopath scatters and their influence becomes negligible in society. To perpetuate their control, psychopaths are always skilled. They're very adept at manipulating other people into thinking that they need them, that they need to continue to do what they're doing in that particular society. Otherwise, the society would somehow collapse into mayhem and chaos. So part of their whole MO is they need to convince you that they're necessary, that their ways are necessary, that their worldview is necessary, and that society as a whole could never survive without them. That's part of their main manipulation tactic. That somehow they perform some vital and necessary service for humanity, and if they were ever to be exposed and routed out, and society would be without them, that total chaos would result. And they're playing on that primal fear of chaos, nested deep within the human psyche, to get people to stand down, not expose them, and not ultimately deal with them in whatever way they need to deal with them to mitigate their influence. okay? One of the ways that they continue to reinforce this untrue notion, okay, is fear and dependency. Fear and dependency. That's what they want to continuously reemphasize. They want you to always be afraid of something. Always be afraid of something. That's how they can continue to manipulate. If you're afraid, their tactic of controlled opposition, or of Hegelian dialectic is also going to work, because this is how they work, through chaos, through the fear of chaos. Okay? And they're going to create chaotic situations in our midst. Once they get people to have a fearful reaction to it, this chaotic event happens and the people have, a fearful reaction has been invoked on the part of the general population, then the psychopath steps in. They want to pose as the savior. They offer their totally self-serving solution that advances their agenda that they already have planned for the very problems which they themselves initiated. Okay? They have one overall objective. They need to make others as similar to themselves as possible. So they need people to take on their worldview. If people don't take on their worldview, their influence is completely stifled in society because there's so few of them. They need the huge horde of secondary psychopaths to be willing to take on their worldview, to do their bidding, or to simply accept reality as their vision of it dictates. They have a vision of reality that they want people to accept is the way things are. And for other people who just don't care, which is a form of becoming secondarily psychopathic, to just say, well, that's the way it is. Nothing you could do about it. And to stand down. Never attempt any change, to affect any change in the world. So many people are in this condition. Let me tell you something. So many people in my family are in this condition. And probably many listeners as well. They don't care that the world is the way that it is. They don't care that there's injustice. They don't care that there are rights being violated constantly around every corner. They look at their worldview is, that's other people's problem. Doesn't affect me. And they're wrong. They're just as wrong as the psychopath is wrong, that they're never going to be brought to justice. They're just as wrong. See, their rule can only continue when we're only focused on our own gain, on ourselves. That's it. When we worship money, greed, selfishness, okay? When we remain in ignorance, even amongst the incredible amounts of information that exist in our world, we don't want to really learn about morality. We don't want to really learn about what rights are and what they're not, what we have a right to do, what we do not have a right to do. We don't want to extend the non-aggression principle to others around us. We don't want to take that into our own understanding and then extend it to all others. And we don't even want to understand that we have a right to defend ourselves against the psychopath. Physically, if necessary. Humanity wants to remain in all of this ignorance and selfishness and self-centeredness and think we can somehow prosper and get out of the control that we're under. And it doesn't work that way. Psychopaths can only be contained when people start refusing to taking on their worldview and being like them in any way. We have to stop basically exuding the same characteristics of the psychopath at a lower level until we can get above where they're operating from a place of consciousness. Nothing's going to happen. And if enough people can't do that, I would make the very uncomfortable statement that the people who can do that, the small group of people who can do that, then it becomes their responsibility to physically act, to move humanity forward, regardless of what that may mean for them in a physical sense. A sacrifice then has to be made, if you will. And this is exactly what the founders of this country decided. They attempted to deal with the psychopath in the first way that is stated that they can be dealt with. Escape. Go somewhere or leave the psychopath isolated, or leave them where you're at if you can, and you go someplace else. Either isolate them or isolate yourself from them. And that's why a lot of people came over here. One of the reasons. Of course, are there hidden agendas within because psychopaths infiltrated that? Yes. Okay? They had right from the beginning, that's why they wanted to control people's worldview, that, oh, you can't cross that ocean. They want to put notions out there, oh, that can't be done. They knew it could be all the time. That knowledge was always there and hidden from the people. To cross over to the quote-unquote new world. They wanted to keep that knowledge from them so people would just stay in their tyranny. And then when people said, no, I'm going to make the effort to go over the ocean to the other continent that we know is there, and I don't care what that may mean, how much of a hardship that may be to build up from nothing, we're going to do it anyway because we want to get away from these psychopaths. See, the problem was consciousness still wasn't high enough. They still couldn't really isolate the influence of the psychopath and prevent the psychopath from coming over there. And then when the British decided we're going to come over here with our psychopathic hordes called the British Navy, and the British Army and land troops on the shores of a people who simply wanted to be free and to be left alone, those psychopaths came over here. And how did the founders decide to deal with them? How did the people who waged the Revolutionary War against the British decide to deal with those psychopaths? You want to know how they decided to deal with them? They decided to shoot them. That's it. I'm sure they had many a conversation attempting to warn them about the error of their ways. And ultimately, the psychopath, the secondary psychopaths that were the British, serving the primary psychopaths of the crown, would not back down. Because you didn't have enough psychological influence present. You didn't have enough truly morally educated people present. You didn't have enough people truly at a higher level of awareness and consciousness. And so the only other option that would be available was exercised. And that was to defend one's life, liberty, and property against incursion of violence through the use of defensive force, and to beat physically back their oppressors by whatever amount of force was required to do it. Now, I'm going to open up the phones for the rest of the show, and the question that I want to hear answered from people first, and then we can talk about psychopathy. But this is the question that's going to be on the floor for this show, the next show, and probably the one after it, because I'm going to continue to talk about this dynamic for the next 2 weeks minimum. Okay? Was what the Revolutionary War fighters in America at the time of the American Revolution were their actions acts of hate against their fellow man, or were their actions acts of love for their fellow man? And why do you think that? I'm sure people can easily extrapolate where I fall in this dynamic, what I feel. It's probably no secret. But I would like to know where the listenership is at with this and hear why they feel on either side of that dynamic. So let's go to the phones and get your take on this. Here we go. Caller from the 602 area code. I believe this is Ivan in Phoenix, if I'm not mistaken. You're live on What on Earth is Happening. Welcome.
Hi, Mark. Yeah, it is Ivan.
Okay. Ivan, let me pose the question to you directly. Do you feel that the actions of the founding fathers of this country and those who waged the Revolutionary War against the British in 1775 and 6, do you feel that what they did were acts of hate or acts of love? And why?
That's kind of, I don't want to say a loaded question, because obviously to start killing, the British is kind of hateful, using violence. But I understand that, yeah, they wanted to be free, and have a place for their kind, the people that wanted to leave England, to be free. So that was an act of love, to get out from under that, tyranny. So yeah, it was an act of love. But yeah, I guess it's kind of twofold, that yin yang thing,
Let me
have
ask
the
you a
good with the
question.
bad.
We have to make the distinction between were actions already being done to them that drove them to take counteraction. In other words, of course, just killing would of course be a violation of natural law. Murder, meaning the initiation of killing, would of course be a violation of natural law. The revolutionaries were not murdering the British, regardless of what anyone thinks. They were not acts of murder. They were acts of defense. Who were the aggressors? Who were the initiators of force? Were the revolutionaries the initiators of force, or were the British revolutionaries of force? In other words, all things being equal, would the revolutionaries who picked up their weapons and fought the British never have initiated violence against the British if they were left alone?
Right. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, you're right. If they would have been left to their own, then
there
everything
would
would have been
have
fine.
been no violence. There would have been no usages of force. The violence was initiated by the British. They listened to a psychopath who gave them orders, got on a wooden ships before there were well-made ocean vessels like there are today, with scurvy and disease and all kinds of, poisonous, deleterious conditions on a boat going across the Atlantic Ocean just to oppress people who they never met in their lives, many of them. And we're doing the same thing. The United States, people who call themselves Americans are doing the same thing here to other countries, listening to the whims of the psychopath who wants to remain in control, getting on a ship or a plane, going to a foreign land and oppressing people that they never met for resources and control. It's a disgrace. It's a total loathsome disgrace that these people should not even be called human beings. They are so vile, and I hold them in total contempt. That's how vile these people are. The nerve of them to think what they're doing is somehow their right. You have nerve, is all I have to say to those people. And I'm talking about the military of the United States. You have nerve thinking that what you're doing is somehow a right on your part, when all you're doing is serving psychopathic interests, just like the British were serving the interests of the psychopaths of the crown, of the king. Okay? Coming over here to oppress people. And then you want to say that when they fight back physically against you, you're going to call them insurgents? You're going to call them terrorists? Well, that's just like saying that the founding fathers were terrorists, which was what these psychopathic police training manuals and training seminars want to try to condition and brainwash police into thinking that the founding fathers of this country were terrorists for wanting their freedom. Being a terrorist for not wanting to be a slave? Really? You're a terrorist for not wanting to be a slave, and for saying that if a psychopath keeps coming at me and refusing to acknowledge that I am a free human being and trying to make me be their slave, that I have no right to physically defend themselves and kill that person if necessary. They're out of their minds. That is a human right, ladies and gentlemen. And the revolutionaries exercised it. They said enough is enough, and they exercised that right. And they did what was required. They took the secondary psychopaths out, just like we did in World War II. We had to do it again, unfortunately. And I don't look at that as it was a manipulation, yes. You can look at all the ways World War II was manipulated, but to simply stand back and allow the product of that manipulation, called the Nazis, to just take over the world would have been a massive wrongdoing on the part of the people. And we did have to go in there and wage war on these psychopaths. And in a lot of ways now, we're the new psychopaths. We're the new psychopaths. America. We're the new Nazis waging war on the other countries of the world to try to take their resources and control their people. And this is what the imbeciles, calling themselves soldiers, who have never looked at the truth because they've never worked with themselves, they've never done any psychic cleansing in their lives, and God forbid if they've ever really opened up a book in their life, okay, don't want to look at the truth of, because they don't want to understand that they're the bad guys, because they're secondarily psychopathic, and they've been trained to be. They've been conditioned to be. We talked about that on the show when we talked about the techniques of cults. The techniques of cults used against the military and the police. These are occult techniques that have existed for thousands and thousands of years and are being used to great effectiveness in putting the police and military into secondarily psychopathic conditions, whether they were genetic or primary psychopaths or not. So, there has to come a time when we understand we always maintain the right to use defensive force against people who will not stop coming against our rights. We have a right to exercise what is a right, actions which are rights. People don't have a right to stop us from exercising rights any more than they have a right to do something to us that is not a right, that is causing harm and is actually a wrong. They have no right to initiate that force. What you need to look at is who is initiating the force, to know who's in the wrong. And then the right always exists for a retaliatory response in the physical. You don't have to engage that response, but does the right exist? Absolutely, yes, it does. If you are walking in open territory and you are accosted, you have a right to defend yourself with physical force by whatever means you have at your disposal to do it. A gun, a knife, a club, fists, feet, anything, doesn't matter. A broken bottle, a stone, a stick, whatever you have at your disposal. That's your inherent natural law right. Okay? And these psychopaths want to convince you you don't have that right to respond to violence with defensive force. They want to convince you don't have that right. That they have to act as an intermediary. You need to go to the priest class called the police. That's just like a priest is an intermediary, claims being an intermediary between you and God. The nerve of that claim. A police officer claims to be the intermediary between you and those who would cause you physical harm, and saying you don't have the right to use defensive force, you have to go through us. The nerve, the absolute unmitigated gall of a person who believes they have rights that someone else does not. The right to prevent someone else from using one of their rights to defend their physical body. Imagine. And for those who say I'm getting too three-dimensional and, I'm talking too much about physicality here, okay? They need to understand there's no distinguishing between the physical and the spiritual. This is another big lie, okay? The manifestations that happen on the physical plane are a result of what is taking place in the spiritual domain. So for all it affects, it's just a cause and effect relationship, and they are one and the same. This is the whole problem with religion and science. Religion places the spiritual in a higher context as superior to the physical, and science tries to place the physical in a superior position to the spiritual, and both are incorrect. They don't have a holistic, integrated view. that the spiritual domain and physical domain are essentially one and the same through the relationship that they share, which is what all of the great mystery tradition teachings of millennia have been trying to get humanity to understand. So this is a huge problem in the whole worldview of people. They're convinced that they don't have rights that they do. And taking up arms when someone is in oppression is one of our rights. As a matter of fact, the founders really attempted to enshrine it in the founding documents of this country, saying that you have a right and duty to abolish oppressive government. Saying that the only thing that they felt was necessary, they used the word necessary one time in the Constitution, a well-regulated militia necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Necessary. Because they knew firearms were for the defense of freedom against encroaching tyranny. And that was their proper use. Firearms are not for hunting. Firearms are not even for just simple home protection or protection for your physical body as you walk among society. That they are ancillary or secondary mechanisms, secondary purposes for the defensive use through weapons. The primary use is so that you have the ability to defend yourself from encroaching tyranny of government. And the founders understood that. And attempting to enshrine the right to use physical force in the founding documents of this country was not acts of hate or acts of terrorism, regardless of what any distorted logic may get people to believe. They were acts of love. They were acts of higher consciousness understanding that freedom is a gift of the Creator and needs to be defended at all times and places, regardless of how it needs to be defended. So I think I want to make it very clear for people where I stand on this issue. The founders of this country didn't murder anybody. They killed people, yes. They didn't murder anybody. The British were the murderers. And, let's not get tied up in where people are from in the world. People from the UK may be listening right now. I'm not talking about you right now. The people who did those acts were murderers who came over here and attempted to oppress the people on these shores. Were not killers. They were murderers. There's a difference between killing and murdering. Murdering, you initiated the force when you had no right to, so it was violence. Murder is a result of violence. Killing can be either a result of violence if it is murder, or if it is not murder, if it is defensive use of force, then it is not murder. It is simply killing someone who would not back down, coming at you with violence. So the distinction is this simple. I'm walking on the street. I happen to be carrying a concealed firearm. Someone comes up to me with another firearm and says, "Give me all of your property. Give me all your valuables, your money, your whatever jewelry you may have on you, your wallet, etc. And I like those shoes. While you're at it, take those off, and they're mine too." I take out my firearm and put a hole in them, right through the chest. Done. They're dead. I murdered no one, ladies and gentlemen, as a result of doing that. If you don't understand that, you're under mind control. That was a defensive killing, because the other person came at me with violence and the intent to murder. If I did not agree to the usurpation of my will to his will. And therein lies the act of coercion that I have a natural law right to defend myself against. And this is what we're up against in the psychopathic condition of humanity. And these psychopaths want to try to condition us and brainwash us into believing that we may never fight back. We may never actually physically take our freedom. They want to think it can never be done like that. Well, let me give you a pointer here. Let me give you a little piece of advice. That's the only way that it ever has been done. It's never been done any other way. Do you see human consciousness rising to the point before it needs to be done in that way, such that humanity will just suddenly wake up and say, no, my God, what are we doing? We're so wrong. Did the British do that? Were there enough people to convince them of the wrongness of their actions? Did the Nazis do that? Did any other oppressive regime? Did the Russians under Stalin, under Lenin, etc., do that? Did the people today living in the United States, are the people today living in the United States under the regimes that we're living under today, calling themselves presidencies, ultimately directed by high-level globalist think tanks, the UN and other organizations directing the globalist agenda? Do you see the people rising up in consciousness to say no to this agenda? Do you see massive amount of military refusing to follow their orders in these illegal wars of aggression? Do you see massive amounts of police refusing their orders to continue to continue to usurp the natural inherent rights of other people? No, you don't see it. I don't see it. I would love to see the evidence of it. I would love people to come forward and bring this evidence forward to me and show me where this is happening at. But I see no evidence of that happening. That's why we have to really understand the reason that we have the ability to use defensive force. If it was never there to be used, we wouldn't even have the capability of doing it. We have to understand that that's a sacred obligation, and it needs to put into effect when there's not going to be any other way to preserve human freedom. Now, that's as controversial as it gets, and I don't really care who's listening. I don't care who's listening. No more than if I was in the Revolutionary War, I would have cared that the Crown was listening. Let me tell you something. The people who... Welcome, one and all. You're listening to What on Earth is Happening here on the Oracle Broadcasting Radio Network. I'm your host, Mark Passio. My website, whatonearthishappening.com. The network's website, oraclebroadcasting.com. Today is Sunday, December 9th, 2012. This show is live every Sunday from 5 to 7 p.m. East Coast time. That's 4 to 6 p.m. Central time. We have a great show lined up for you here today. We're going to be continuing to talk about human psychopathy and the possible defenses against it. And we are going to continue to take your calls on the topic of, was the acts of the founders of this country during the American Revolution, the actions that they decided to take against their oppressors for the preservation, the security of the freedom of those who would come after them, were those acts that they took acts of love or acts of hate, and why you think so either way. Chip-in campaign. Okay. Let's jump into our topic for discussion today, which is a continuation from last week, and it is on human psychopathy and defense against the psychopath. Now, I'm going to post a couple of videos with this week's podcast, and I do have some images. Last week I had no images because I really wanted to focus and hammer into people the characteristics of the psychopath, the personality traits and characteristics of the psychopathic personality. So I didn't even want any images to get in the way last week so that people can really focus on what this horrid condition that plagues humanity is actually all about. This week I made a few images, and you can find those as always on the whatonearthishappening.com radio show page. Click the radio show tab, and you will see listed underneath the player for the show images for today's show. Now that is when the show is live, of course. When the show is not live, I take that off of the radio show page, and it goes into the podcast with the show, okay, with each podcast. So you can find the images also in the podcast section of the website under related images for each podcast that is posted there. Today we have 5 images. The first image was, of course, the Free Your Mind 2 event poster. And the next image begins, we'll do a review from last week, which is the characteristics of psychopaths. And I put some lovely imagery to go along with these couple of slides. Image number 2 shows definite psychopaths that are basically involved in the daily administration of our world. And I'm sure people are just thrilled to see such wonderful pictures here with such in-depth listings of the characteristics of these sick, twisted individuals. So to do a brief review, let's go over some of the characteristics of the psychopath that we talked about last week. And with the podcast, I'm going to post a couple of great documentaries this week. I think very important documentaries to see about the psychopath. There's 2 of them in particular. Is Defense Against the Psychopath, which is a short documentary. I believe it is is right around a half an hour or something like that. And this video really does a good job explaining what psychopathy is and what are the best defense strategies once we recognize that people, certain people that we are interacting with may be, or in fact are, psychopaths. We need to wake up to this on a mass scale because psychopaths are actually running all of the institutions that people place their faith in as a society. And, you know, that's not a good idea anyway, to place your faith in institutionalized bodies, because they're all essentially corrupt. And the main thing to keep in mind is that they are ultimately run by psychopaths at the highest levels. Psychopaths have infiltrated the institutions of the world so that they can work their way into positions of influence and power, and thereby hold power and influence over people who basically externalize their power through their belief in these institutional bodies and the belief that they should be directing humanity and taking care of humanity, and so forth and so on. We need to start to withdraw our support from these institutions, and specifically these so-called leaders. The whole idea here is to get away from the collectivist mindset and understand we don't need leaders, we need to be our own leaders. So as a brief review, before we start going into other material and into the phone lines, let's take a look at the characteristics of psychopathy. These include aggressiveness. Now I'm referring to what is listed on slide number 2 right now. Aggressiveness, callousness, the complete absence of conscience, the complete absence of empathy toward other human beings. Cunning thinking. Now this isn't to say actual intelligence, true holistic intelligence, but cunning intellect would probably be even perhaps better. Left brain intellect only, the desire to control, okay? Adeptness at the manipulation of others, very good at manipulating people. The willingness to engage in strongly immoral criminal conduct to get their way. The willingness to take what they want and do as they please, regardless of who is hurt or wronged. No care for whether someone else suffers. And I know it's very difficult for most people to believe that this is a condition that exists within the human psyche of people who have absolutely no empathy and do not care how much anyone suffers as a result of their actions, but it is the case. And this is, again, split between 2 different categories of psychopaths. The primary psychopath, who it is a genetic disorder in the human genome, and they are born that way. It doesn't make a difference what environment they are put in. They simply are that way. It is a damaged computer from birth. Again, something many people do not want to face and want to think does not exist. And that's Doesn't make a difference whether they don't want to believe it or not. This condition is here with us. What created it, we'll get into on other shows and possibilities for that. But they don't want to admit that this condition exists due to the implications that it actually means for us here on Earth. The implications are quite disturbing. They're not comfortable whatsoever. They're very disturbing implications because, again, we have to wrestle with that question of what put this condition here with us. Why does it exist? So let's continue to list the characteristics. The willingness to take what they want and do as they please, regardless of who is hurt or wronged. A deceptive ability to appear outwardly benevolent. Oh yeah, they'll make you think that they have your own interest in mind, but they absolutely do not. They have only their own selfish motives in mind. So they can behave in superficially charming ways to hide purely selfish motives. Make you think they have your interest in mind when in fact they're not interested in you at all. They have your interest not at all in mind, only their own. They have a willingness to use intimidation and, if necessary, violence to control others in order to satisfy their own needs. So it's their own needs, their own gratification above all else, no matter who has to be harmed in the process. The willingness, we're on slide number 3 now, moving forward to slide number 3. They have the willingness to intentionally violate the basic inherent human rights of other people. A complete absence of any sense of guilt or remorse. So not only don't they feel empathy for what they do, they don't feel guilty after the fact. There is no guilt or remorse shown for the harm that their actions cause to other people. None whatsoever. They rationalize their own immoral behavior. They try to, basically, it's justification. They try to create rights that don't exist and say, oh, well, that was necessary. I had to do that. When in fact, no, they didn't. They wanted to do that. They revel in what they're doing. And then they try to tell other people that it was necessary or needed, or it was for the common good, it was for the long-term good. When in fact, all it was is to satisfy their own twisted, sick, depraved desires that they want to satisfy at the expense of anyone else. They have denial about their own wrongdoing. They'll deny it outright. They'll just lie and say, no, I'm not responsible for that. That's not my responsibility. I didn't cause that. When in fact they were directly to blame or directly at fault, or they were the direct cause of the suffering that was created. Feelings of utter contemptuousness toward the feelings and desires of their fellow human beings. So what your cares or wants or needs or desires are, absolutely meaningless to them. It doesn't make a difference what anyone else may need or what may be important to anyone else. That is completely irrelevant to them, and they have utter contemptuousness. They hate people for the fact that they have needs, wants, desires, but at the same time, what these psychopaths are doing is doing nothing but trying to fuel their own depraved desires, to satiate their own depraved desires. So utter contemptuousness displayed toward the feelings and desires of their fellow beings. Willingness to lie pathologically. They'll say anything without any concern for truth in order to advance their own hidden agendas. They have the ability, this is one of the biggest characteristics that people really need to understand and get a handle on. Psychopaths have the ability, especially primary psychopaths, okay? Secondary psychopaths can learn this over time, but primary psychopaths have learned this since they were very young, okay? So this is more of a characteristic that is mostly attributed to primary psychopaths. They have an ability, a well-developed ability to fake a normal range of human emotions and empathy. See, they watch other people's emotional responses and then they mimic it, even though they're not really feeling those emotions. They mimic it so that they fool other people into believing that they're just like them. And, then the question comes up, well, how do you identify these people? That's a very good question. And some people emailed me about that. Now, these could be anybody. These are basically anybody in society. I mean, they're well hidden, they're well entrenched, and they're entrenched in positions of power. It's very difficult to identify who these people are. You have to know them by their behavior. Number one, first and foremost. You know the saying, the axiom, that you will know them by their deeds, you will know them by their actions. That's one of the main things to keep in mind. You'll know who these people are by how they behave, first and foremost. We could get into speculation about other possible screening for the psychopath. But again, that would be much more difficult to implement. We have to become streetwise about their behavior in order truly to identify them so that we can be on the defense against them. And again, none of this is to inspire fear or hatred in people. This is about being informed about a condition that does exist. Is basically these people are predatory in nature. They are preying on other people. They are referred to by many people as interspecies predators. They're within our species, and again, I don't really fully agree with that definition because I don't even consider them the same species. I consider this a whole nother animal that looks like a human being, walks and talks like a human being, but ultimately is not really a true human being. There's something else altogether, because what truly makes a human human, okay, what makes the characteristics of a human being truly human is the ability to feel. And if we lack that, then we're not truly human. We've become something that is degenerated from a human being, that is less than a true human being. And for anybody that wants to say that's divisive or separatist or, is very dualistic, go right ahead. I'm not interested in some new age nonsensical interpretation of what is actual in the world. Okay, instead of calling it what it is, looking at it honestly, people want to euphemize things. Okay, so they don't have to actually acknowledge the horror of the current human situation. It's all about euphemisms, making things appear less bad than what they actually are. And ladies and gentlemen, what I'm doing, I can't articulate how bad it actually is. Trust me, everything I have done on this show is an understatement regarding how bad our current situation is in the human psyche. It's so infinitely worse than what I could even articulate in words. People have no idea. And, people will call me a pessimist as a result of saying that out in the open. But believe me, it's worse than whatever I'm saying. Okay? I'm actually underplaying where we're at as a species. For some reason, I want people to still accept the notion that we could turn this around if we worked hard enough to influence people in consciousness to come up. And maybe it's possible. But, in a lot of ways, I don't really even know if I believe that myself. And I'm just being honest with people. I'm just being honest. If that makes me a pessimist, so be it. I consider myself a realist regarding where the human dynamic in consciousness is really at based on what I see on a day-to-day basis in the world. And I try to be as honest as possible about that instead of sugarcoating the situation and telling people what they want to hear. Because so many people will sell people on that, telling them what they want to hear. There's so many people who are so good at that. The New Age movement's a big part of that. Telling people what they want to hear, making them think it's better than how it actually is, to sell hope. Hope is very sellable. Believe me, it's sellable. All you have to do is look at presidential campaigns and elections. Then people think that this, a new guy getting in there is going to mean new hope. And they'll constantly sell people on that because they're just telling people what they want to hear. I'm trying to be honest with people. I'm not in this as a popularity contest. All right? I'm not interested in who likes me or who doesn't like me. That's not why I do what I do. I'm trying to be honest with people about where we're really at. So we need to understand that it's worse than what I'm saying. And while I don't think that the numbers of primary psychopaths are all that impressive, I think they're very low. I think they're lower than what a lot of clinical psychologists place the number at. I think it's far less than 1%. You know, the people who say, oh, it's the 1%, I think it's maybe the 0.5%. And I think that might be a high number about how many true primary psychopaths there are in humanity. Yet they're still running the entire show here. They're still in charge because they have infected the rest of the population with their worldview. That's the whole thing. We think largely like the psychopath to a certain extent. Their worldview is still infecting our psyche. And so many people have become secondarily psychopathic, meaning through conditions and through the acceptance of a particular worldview, they are taking on the characteristic traits of a primary psychopath, even though they are not, and they were not born that way. Okay, they're behaving that way because of fundamentally flawed axioms and belief systems that they have taken into themselves and are fundamentally attached to. And letting go of those false fundamental axioms, letting go of those dogmatic belief systems, and engaging in new, different information that has the possibility to transform and elevate consciousness. By doing that, it is possible to get one's psyche out of that state, that diseased state, that pathological condition. That's why it's called psychopathy, pathological, based in an illness. Okay? Now, other things are required in the physical domain as well. You know, we need to clean up the body. The body has a lot to do with how we think. We don't often associate that, but the mind and body are intricately and inextricably interconnected. So cleaning up one's diet is a huge part of how we think. So that has to go hand in hand with disconnecting from the poison information, getting onto a positive and truthful information stream, eating better, you know, disconnecting from other poisonous influences around us, meaning the other people with poisonous worldview infections that constantly feed us negative information about the worth of humanity and about, you know, who we truly are as a people. So let's go back to some of the characteristics and wrap this up, because I want to transition this into the defense against the psychopath and then start to go to the phones. Psychopaths, okay, the ability to feign normal human emotions, that's very critical. And again, the question then becomes, how do we identify them? Again, we need to know them by their actions, and then we can speculate about possible other techniques to identify these people. They have a severely distorted sense of the consequences of their own actions. See, they don't understand that the universe is going to bring things to balance. By one means or another, it's going to bring it to balance, no matter how catastrophic that may need to be, depending on how out of balance things have become. Guaranteed, the universe is going to balance the equation. And these people don't want to understand or accept that aspect of natural law. They refuse. See, they only want their own desires fulfilled and forget about what creation wants. You know, forget about the will of creation. You know, the true evolutionary progress that is happening throughout creation, true evolution in consciousness, that's meaningless to these people. They're trying to stop that from taking place because they want to rule the roost. They want to maintain their positions of dominance and power, illusory power over other people, because they're being given that power by other people who are externalizing their power in an illusory sense and through this nonsensical, illusory belief in authority, which doesn't actually exist in man. So this severely distorted sense of the consequences of their own behavior. They have Total failure to accept any personal responsibility for their own actions. Forget acceptance of responsibility. They always want to deflect. Blame somebody else. It wasn't my fault. I refuse to take responsibility for what they clearly have done. And this is part of the human condition on a wider sense. We don't want to take responsibility as a people for what we have allowed the psychopaths to do and for what we continue to do because they're ordering us to do it. See, this refusal of responsibility, to accept personal responsibility, this goes, our refusal as largely as a people is a reflection of the psychopaths' refusal to accept personal responsibility because they don't want to accept responsibility. Okay, they try to pass the buck down to the next person. In other words, if they could get away with it, they would prefer not to actually do the behavior, but to tell someone else to do the behavior. That's how they think they're going to shield themselves or insulate themselves from the repercussions of natural law. They're going to get somebody else to do their dirty work for them. And then most of us will do that. We'll just do it for a paycheck or do it to make our lives easier in some form or fashion. Okay? Because most of us don't have a developed sense of conscience. We won't say no. And this is the whole problem. We continue to uphold the psychopaths. They're a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction, and yet they're ruling billions of people because we can't continue to do their bidding. And they have the hordes of secondary psychopaths in the police, the military, the government, educational institutions, medical institutions, pharmaceuticals, etc. You name any institution in the world, banking, okay? The secondary psychopaths largely are running these institutions. Just put your head down, do what you're told, do your job, and you'll get your reward for doing it. It doesn't matter who you have to hurt, okay? We'll try to shield you from seeing the suffering that you're causing, okay? They're really good at continuing to do that, and most people will just go ahead and do that. And in doing that, they're numbing out their emotions and they're ultimately turning. So very slowly, it's a stepwise progress, a progression over time, turning into a secondary psychopath who are acting as the hordes that do the bidding of the primary psychopath masters that are ruling at the highest levels of the institutions. And this is what we need to understand, that the only way to stop the progression of this tyranny in our world is to stop behaving like the psychopath. Meaning, if you know that something is wrong and you know it's ultimately violating the rights of someone else, you have to pull your actions back from that through the process of apophasis, saying no, the lost word, the most powerful word in the universe. Say no to that which you know is not a right, to that which you know is causing harm to someone else. And if more people did that, the psychopaths could never possibly have their way. They could never create the world that they want to create because no one would help them do it. Unfortunately, too many people are willing to help these psychopaths create the world in the image that they want to create it in. Because since they've worked their way up to the positions of power already and infiltrated those positions, these institutions shouldn't even exist to have these positions of power. That's the entire problem. We believe that there is such a thing as power invested in institutions that is going to tell people how they should behave and act. That's the entire problem. That's a collectivist worldview. And the whole problem is psychopaths invariably, unwaveringly will worm their way into those institutionalized positions of power, take them over, and then once they're entrenched, it's very difficult to get them out. They run those institutions generationally, passing down their influence to the next breed of psychopaths. And this is another reason that a lot of psychopaths, especially in royalty, are huge into inbreeding, because they want to keep the characteristic traits of primary psychopathy, which is contained in the genetic information to a large extent in the family, so that their bloodlines can continue to stay in those same institutionalized positions of influence and power. It may only make sense. I mean, if you just sit and think about it, it makes perfect sense. So to finish up the characteristics of the psychopath, the final characteristic is that they believe that they'll never be brought to justice. They think they can do what they're doing indefinitely and never be held to account. And I said last week, in a very strong, forceful, and no uncertain term way, they are incorrect about that. I know that they're incorrect about that because in one way or another, whether it happens in the physical domain or not, they are going to be held to account. And so is everyone who is helping them. Just let me repeat that one more time. Regardless of where or when it is going to take place, the psychopaths of this world are going to be held to account for their behavior. So is everyone who is helping them. And you could not believe that if you want, but your disbelief will never make that statement untrue. That is how the universe functions, to bring balance to creation. Now, as to how or when, I can't necessarily say, but guaranteed it will happen. The universe will that into existence at some point in time. Now, I think the way that they should be brought to balance is through our actions to counter and defend ourselves against the psychopath. I don't think we should leave it to the spiritual justice of the universe, quite frankly. I think that's a cop-out for our experience in the physical domain. So I believe we have the right to bring these people to justice ourselves. I ultimately believe that's how the universe would prefer to bring these psychopaths to justice, through people who are acting within right behavior. See, if that doesn't happen, that means ultimately there wasn't a quantum number of people who are willing to get involved and make that justice occur. So the universe is going to do it for us in a very unpleasant way, and in a way that is going to not only bring them to justice, but it's going to ultimately bring all the other people to justice for not acting on behalf of the universe and holding them to account in the first place. And this is where humanity is almost at that point. And people will say, oh, that's alarmist. You're inspiring fear and saying something bad's going to happen if people don't act. Well, it's the truth. You think that we can just let these psychopaths do immoral behaviors forever and there's nothing that's going to result to us? Nothing bad is going to happen? And this is part of what tyranny is ultimately all about. Because the causal factor, that we are not bringing them to justice, that we are not standing up for our inherent human rights, the world is slipping further and further into global totalitarian tyranny. That's one of the ways that we're being punished by the entire, construct of natural law, because we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing in getting these people out of these positions of power, stop externalizing our power to these so-called leadership institutions, and start actually being our own leaders and live for what we know is right. Not enough people are willing to do that. Not enough people are actually engaging in that behavior. So at some point, the universe is going to step in and say, enough is enough. There's been a stagnation here. No progress is possible. And therefore, cleansing is going to be required. Like when weeds choke a garden, ultimately they're going to have to be uprooted. And if we become like those weeds choking the garden, which is evolutionary progression in consciousness, which is what the purpose of the garden is for, if we become those allegorical weeds, then we're going to have to be uprooted at some point when no further growth is possible. And the universe will be all too happy to provide that service for us. Do we want that to occur that way? I think it's a very bad choice, personally. But ultimately, that's what's going to happen. So the next part I want to get into this is understanding that we already inherently have the right to defend ourselves against psychopaths, about people that don't care about right or wrong, that don't care about conscience, that aren't acting within conscience, that are just doing what they want to do to get what they want. And this is the whole, let me just be very clear about this. This is the whole dynamic, the whole personality characteristic, or the rationalization of, I'm just doing my job. Okay? That whole thing that people trot out as a justification, ultimately it means, here's what you're saying. I want people to be very laser focused on what I'm saying here. When someone is saying, I'm just doing my job, and the action that they're taking is actually hurting someone else or usurping their rights through some form of coercion that they had no right to initiate. All right? When that's happening and someone is saying, I'm just doing my job, what they are basically saying is, my collection of money or resources or acquiring a position that I might want usurps someone else's free will to engage in their rights or to not be harmed, not have initiatory force carried out against them when there was no right to do so. Okay? They're basically saying, I don't care about that person being harmed. That is the definition of not having conscience, of not exercising conscience. You could even make the argument whether the person has the knowledge of right or wrong, which is what conscience is, knowledge, science, to get to know together. Science, the root of it being sciere, the verb in Latin sciere, which means to know, and the prefix con being put in front of it, which means together or with. So to know together, to know with everyone else, common sense of right and wrong. That's what conscience is, common knowledge, common sense knowledge. Whether they actually possess that or not, they're not exercising it. They're not acting, willfully acting within harmony with conscience, with that knowledge. So therefore, they are abandoning conscience by saying, I'm going to do what my job says I need to do to collect my paycheck or to maintain that position, regardless of who it's harming. By definition, that is a psychopathic characteristic. You are taking on at least one of the characteristics of psychopathy. Well, it's rationalization of your own immoral behavior. Okay, it's attempt to lay blame upon someone else for your own conduct. You're saying the people who gave me these orders are ultimately responsible. You're denying your own wrongdoing outright. Okay, you're willing to violate the inherent human rights of other people. You're willing to engage in criminal conduct to get your way. And it's all to just, again, have your needs satisfied or met at the expense of someone else's rights. And I would suggest a large portion, or if not the majority, of people who are in institutions where they're saying, I'm just doing my job, and are ultimately violating the rights of other people, have become secondarily psychopathic at the very least. And what our job is, people who understand the non-aggression principle, who know that if someone else is not violating someone else's rights, you do not have any right to initiate force against them. That's what the non-aggression principle is. It's all about statements in the negative. If someone else is not usurping someone else's rights or using violence, okay, then you do not have a right to initiate force against them. It's all apophatic. It's stated in the negative. You have to understand what you don't have a right to do. People think that rights that do not exist actually exist for certain groups of people. They think that rights that no one on earth has, a bunch of people can come together, create that right, and then grant it to another person or group of people. And that cannot be done. There's no such thing as the delegation of a wrong. This needs to be deeply understood by people. You cannot delegate something that you have no right to do to someone else or to any number of people. Doesn't matter how many people erroneously believe you can do that, it still cannot be done in nature. You could do it in an erroneous construct that exists only within the diseased human psyche, but you cannot do it in actual point of fact reality. Meaning in nature, it cannot be accomplished. Nature is not going to recognize, creation is not going to recognize that as being real. It's your illusion that you've given substance to by believing that you can do it and then acting within that illusory capacity. But it's not real in nature. It's an illusion in a diseased mind that you can delegate a wrong. Wrongs cannot be delegated to anyone because no one has the right to do them. By definition, they're in opposition to right, they are in opposition to morality and natural law, then they cannot be engaged in by any justification or rationalization. See, the only way people believe that they can engage in a wrong or delegate a wrong to someone else is if they accept the fundamentally flawed axiom called moral relativism. Moral relativism must be accepted somewhere in the person's psyche in order for them to believe that a wrong can be delegated. Because if you understand the absolute objective nature of right and wrong, you understand it is impossible if someone does not have a right, meaning if the behavior is a wrong because it causes harm to others, then, and no one on earth has it as an individual, that action can never be delegated to a group of people. Any other individual or group, it's an impossibility to do in point of fact reality. Yet, humanity does it every day in every corner of the world. Giving rights to police and military that they'll say that the public doesn't have. We need to understand we already possess the right to defend ourselves. We don't need any institutions to exercise inherent rights to self-defense against people that would cause us harm, who don't care. And the institutions who are ostensibly doing that defense, which they're not really doing, they're serving the desires of the psychopath. If you are honest with yourself, that's what they're doing. They're the army for the psychopaths, the people who we claim are actually, the defenders of the people. They're nothing of the kind. They're the army for the psychopath to defend the psychopaths against the people, against the bulk of humanity. They don't have the rights to do what they're doing. And rationalization and justification to say, I'm only doing my job by usurping your rights, doesn't hold any water. And it shouldn't be accepted by anyone. So, moving to image number 4, we need to re-examine something that we talked about in the section that we talked about on natural law, and that is the dichotomy, the total polarization. These are diametric opposites. People use these terms synonymously, and they are not synonyms. They are antonyms. They are exact diametric opposites. They are the antitheses of each other. Force and violence have nothing to do with each other. People really need to deeply understand this from a natural law perspective. Violence has nothing to do with the proper use of force. You can look at it in terms of use versus abuse. Use versus abuse. You have a right to use force. You have no right ever to engage in violence. And what is the determining factor or characteristic between these two types of action? The determining characteristic is the initiation. Who started it? A big part of brainwashing, particularly in American culture, but I would probably suggest that this brainwashing goes on all over the world, is that it matters who starts violence. That it doesn't matter who starts violence. The brainwashing is that it doesn't matter who starts violence. What I'm telling people is all that matters is who starts it. That's what defines it as violence. When someone is breaking the non-aggression principle, it means that they have initiated or started to use force that they had no right to initiate or use. And they're using it in a coercive capacity. They're not using it in a capacity which force is morally intended to be used in. If there was no moral use of force, we wouldn't have the capacity to engage in the universe. Of course there are moral uses of force. There is no such thing as a moral use of violence. And see, I want to give a couple of examples here. I want to look at this dynamic. What is force versus what is violence? How are they diametrically opposed? What are their characteristics? I want to give a couple of examples and very clearly delineate which behaviors in the examples would be violent and which behaviors would simply be forceful. Which behavior, if it is violent, means it is a wrong and the person had no right to engage in that behavior, versus what actions were simply the proper use of force and the person had every right to engage in that behavior. Okay? And then I want to read the Second Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. And again, I'm not a constitutionalist. I've made no bones about it that I don't believe in authority. I don't believe in government. These are illusory constructs. I want to get to the phones. I didn't leave enough time to go to the phones last week. I apologize for that again. I want to leave plenty of time to get to the phones today. So let's start delving back into the material by taking a look at the difference, the diametric opposition between force and violence. And again, before the break, I was saying there is no such thing as authority. There is only the claim of it, the claim that you could do violence to someone else and be right in doing it. Okay? The claim that you could be a master of someone and they have some moral obligation to obey your commands. Okay? You can only make that claim, and then that claim can be accepted by other people, but it will never make it true in reality because it's not true. There is no such thing as masters over others. There is only people who are making the claim that they are an authority. And then there's other people who don't know enough about themselves and the workings of nature who are willing to accept that claim in their ignorance. And I just simply referred to them before the break very harshly as dumb people, because that's what they are. They're just dumb. If you think there's any such thing as authority in man, you are dumb. You are not holistically intelligent, and you do not know the truth. Because the truth is there is no such thing as authority anywhere in the three-dimensional space-time continuum in physical form. The only authority is the boundary conditions of the universe, which is natural law. That's what the authority is. And I don't mean the fake Darwinian natural order that people think of as whoever's has the most viciousness and the biggest teeth and the sharpest teeth and claws wins. That's not what I mean by natural law. Again, I feel I need to keep emphasizing that because of how hijacked the word natural is. We're talking about the spiritual laws that govern behavior in the universe. Cosmic spiritual law. Another word we need to start really taking back and understanding more deeply, just like natural, what natural really means, instead of this Darwinian notion, this twisted worldview based in moral relativism and social Darwinism, we really need to take back the word anarchy. Okay, because knowing that there is no such thing as authority, knowing that there is no such thing as masters over others, knowing that there is no such thing as rulership over other people, needs to be called what it is. The term voluntarist I don't like. It's a euphemism. It waters down what we're really talking about. We need to take back the word anarchy and help people to understand what it means, not only in its etymology, but in its actual real definition, not the mind-controlled, connotative, illusory meaning that people have ascribed to it and accepted that it means. The word anarchy comes from two Greek roots. The first is or an in Greek is the negation of or the absence of, meaning not present, absent, or just simply not being. Okay? That's a or an, the prefix a or an in Greek. So apathy, no feeling present. All right? Anarchy comes from an, not present, okay? Not there, absent. And then the second part comes from the Greek word archon. Archon in Greek means ruler or master. Okay? Someone who is a ruler over someone else. Or in other words, the owner of slaves. An owner of other people. A master of slaves. So when you put them together, you have the negation of masters over others. The absence of ownership of other people. The absence of rulers who own other people. However you want to put those words, those concepts together, that's what anarchy is. It means that there are no masters and slaves. Well, if you believe that there are masters and slaves, then you're not an anarchist. If you do not believe that there are masters and slaves, then by definition you are an anarchist, whether you know it or not. If you advocate for any amount of the right, the so-called right to coerce other people, to coerce their will, to usurp their free will, and make them do what you want them to do, even if what they want to do is a right, then you are not an anarchist, you are an archonist. One who believes in masters over others. One who believes that certain people are masters with authority inherent in them, and other people, by definition, are slaves who somehow have the moral obligation to obey the whims of the master. And there's no other grades of that. People think, oh, there's variants and gradations of that in between. You're painting it as black and white, and there's all shades of gray in between. Wrong. Absolutely incorrect. There is no gradations. There are no shades of gray. There are either masters and slaves or there is not. Get that through your head. Any amount any amount of the advocation of the aggression principle. And I want to wrap the word principle in quotes, because aggressing against others is no principle at all. It is not based in truth, and it causes harm. The aggression ideology, let's call it. Forget aggression principle. There is the non-aggression principle, and then there is the aggression ideology that is based in violence, meaning the violation of someone else's rights. That's why it is called violence, violate. It comes from the word violate. To intrude upon, to go somewhere where you do not belong. You are thieving the inherent rights and security of others by engaging in violation, violence of their rights. So we need to take back the word anarchy and help people to understand it just means no masters and slaves. To say that you're an anarchist means you understand that you are not a slave. That's what being a true anarchist means. Not this twisted connotation that people have that you play a word association game with them and they think it means chaos. That's what the dominators, what the masters who want to maintain their slaves' mindset so that they'll continue to lay down to their commands and be their willing slaves, want people to think the word anarchy means, when it has absolutely nothing to do with chaos. As a matter of fact, chaos can only breed in archonistic conditions, meaning where there are masters. Then you have a condition of chaos. When there are masters and slaves, you have chaos. When there is freedom, you have order. Only when there is true freedom, meaning the absence of masters, a master-slave relationship. No masters, no rulers. That's what anarchy means, and nothing else. So let's take a look at one's inherent right of the use of force versus something that is never a right, which is violence. Force is, by definition, the capacity to do work or cause physical change. Okay? It is energy, strength, or active power. Power that is being applied. We have the capacity to do work, and then we're applying it in the world through an act of force. We engage in force every single day of our lives. If you build something, if you clean something, if you go from one place to another, all of these are, work is required, energy is required, active power is required. You are engaged in force to do any of those behaviors. Once you use the ability or capacity to cause physical change in an immoral way, meaning that you're using initiation of coercion, you have crossed the line from the application of force into the use of violence. Violence is the immoral usage of physical power to coerce, compel, or restrain when you had absolutely no right to engage in that behavior. That's what makes it violence. What makes it violence is that you initiated it. You were not being harmed or attacked, and then you initiated coercive force. That's the definition of what makes it violent. Force is action which exists in harmony with morality, in harmony with natural law, for the very reason that it does not violate anyone else's inherent rights. Violence, on the other hand, is initiatory action, meaning you started it. It's initiatory coercive action. You started it, and it is the action coerces someone else's free will when they were harming no one. This is always in opposition to morality and always in opposition to the laws of nature, because for the very reason that it involves the violation of someone else's inherent rights. Force is action that we always possess a right to take under natural law. it is in harmony with natural law, therefore we may take that action. And this includes the inherent right to defend oneself. Meaning if violence is being done, if initiatory coercive usage of force was initiated against you, that means violence was done unto you, then you inherently already possess, every individual already inherently possesses, without going to another human being, you already have the right to defend yourself against that incursion of violence by applying whatever amount of physical force, energy, strength, or active power is required to stop or negate that act of violence. And I don't know how much clearer I could be. I think that's about as clear of a definition of what force versus violence is. When you're engaged in violence, you never are in the right. There is no such thing as the right to conduct violence, because that means you are initiating, you are starting it. But you always have a right to use defensive force when you're being attacked by violence. And, I think we've been under violence and the threat of violence for a long, long, long time. Not only in this country, but throughout the world. Taxes are threats of violence. Pay us what we tell you have to pay us, or we're going to either take your property or put you in a cage. It doesn't make a difference why someone is demanding that. You can't demand that someone act and say you're not acting is a right you don't have. Yes, you are allowed to sit there and do absolutely no action. You don't have to take action. Now, I would say if you're seeing violence being conducted and not taking action, then we're getting into a very hairy moral territory, because you're witnessing it and you have the capacity to do something to change it, and you're sitting back and saying, let the violence continue. Let that person's rights be completely usurped and just allow it to continue. Now, all kinds of rationalizations are used for why what's being done with that money is going to be a good thing. This is how people rationalize the violence of tax collection away. This is an example of violence, okay? It doesn't matter how you rationalize it. You're saying you have no right to refuse. That's coercion. And if you do refuse and try to keep what you have earned, then you're threatening the person with retaliatory force for simply engaging in a right, which is to keep that which you have produced. This is not a right. Taxation is not a right. People think that it can be granted to a government or a group of people, and that right can be delegated. Well, there is no such thing as the right to collect taxes, because it's based in violence, and therefore it's not a right, it's a wrong. Therefore, it cannot be delegated to any other human being or any group of human beings. Nothing that someone individually may not engage in can be delegated to another. I don't know how much more clear I can make that. Hopefully this is being understood and really sinking in to people, if it didn't in the natural law section. But if you don't have a right as an individual to do something to another person, to coerce them and say, you have to give me this much of what you have produced or earned, then no one can do that, because no one has that right, so no one can give it to someone else. Rights already exist inherently. No new rights can be created. Rights cannot be changed. They're inherent forces in the universe. That's it. They're part of natural law, which are existing conditions that are binding and immutable. That's what rights are. And rights are actually based in what is a wrong. They're based in the apophysis. Wrongdoing needs to be understood, so we can understand what a right is not, first and foremost. Once you understand violence, which is wrongdoing, which is coercive action, the coercive use of force, which one had no right to take, then you can understand anything that falls into that category as a wrong, is violent behavior, and is part of the aggression ideology. Everything that falls outside of that ideology is a right, because it's part of the non-aggression principle. Do not initiate or start coercive force against anyone else so long as you are not being harmed. If you're being harmed actively by an act of violence, you have every right to respond with any amount of defensive force required to put down that attack. And this is what the founders understood of this country. And in many ways, they didn't understand fully enough the non-aggression principle, because they still put things into the Constitution like taxes. You know, they weren't perfect. They weren't fully enlightened. They were still in partial darkness. They were very enlightened in comparison to where people are at today, but in comparison. That doesn't mean they were truly enlightened, fully enlightened all the way. So this is why I end the show with the whole quote from Buddha many times, that there are only two mistakes that one can make on the path to the truth: not starting and not going all the way. Well, the founders had a good start. The foundations of America were a good start into a deeper understanding of natural law. And they enshrined those principles in the Declaration of Independence and partially enshrined them in the Constitution. Definitely took a step down from that, one document to the next, because there are things that are in opposition to natural law in the Constitution. But, and I believe even in the Declaration of Independence, the creation of government at all, but the Declaration I see as a higher consciousness document than even the Constitution, but at least they were partially enlightened, and they were attempting to get people to go further along that path. Certainly coming out of the tyrannical states that government had existed in previous to the foundations of America. So it was a stepping stone, and we should have ratcheted up further and further. Instead, we've slipped back down into tyranny because we didn't listen to the founders' advice. So please, no one should think I'm a constitutionalist as a result of reading something that I happen to resonate with from the U.S. Constitution. I'm an anarchist. It should be, I fully embrace that term. I'm okay with that terminology. I understand what it means. I clarify to people what it means. I embrace the non-aggression principle. I live it in my life. I don't believe that there is any such thing as masters or slaves. That's why I'm an anarchist. I live according to natural law, and that's it. Meaning moral law. Doesn't matter what is legal, it matters what is moral. Legality is the whims of flawed men and women. Moral law comes from creation, or God if you like. People want to get offended about that term, go right ahead, I'm comfortable with it. I know that rights come from God, period. Okay? They don't come from man. Man does not get to make up what is right or what is wrong. This is where man is sick, because he believes he can do those things when he absolutely cannot. So the founders tried to enshrine the inherent right for defensive force into the Constitution. And I want to be very, very clear about this too. It is the only thing in the Constitution that they said, and they were very frugal in their words, and they did not put extraneous concepts into the Constitution that they did not need to articulate upon. They put these words into the Constitution and said that it was the only thing that they deemed necessary for the preservation of freedom. Let me say that one more time. The founders only deemed in the Constitution of the United States one thing or concept necessary for the preservation of freedom. They only deemed one thing necessary for the preservation of freedom. Okay? Think about how important that very concept right there is. Now, the word necessary in the Constitution was used exactly 6 times. But in the context of something being necessary within the structure of America, it is only used in that capacity or that context, that connotation, one time. and that is in the Second Amendment in the Bill of Rights to the Constitution. Now, I want to read the text of the Second Amendment as it was adopted by the Congress and put into the Constitution in the Bill of Rights. And I want people to understand that in this older style of writing, this part of the Bill of Rights, and all parts of the Bill of Rights are, all parts of the Constitution actually, are only intended to ever be restraints upon government. People need to understand that about the Constitution. It is not a listing of rights for the people. It is not a restraint of anything for the people. It is entirely a set of things that the people were going to allow the entity that they were creating, called the U.S. government, United States government, to do, and a much bigger set of restraints upon what the government could never do in anybody's life. So it is written very much so in the apophatic sense. The Bill of Rights is all about what the government may never do, because these are actions which ultimately take away, if done, would take away freedom from people. The First Amendment being the right to free speech, free religion, and free assembly, and free press. So the Second Amendment is about the right to inherently defend oneself against the incursions of violence. And here's what it says. And if we understand that this form of language is not really spoken today, we need to understand how it would be written if it were written today. Then it becomes very much less ambiguous as to what the intent and meaning of the Second Amendment was. And I'm deliberately bringing all this for, see, folks, you have to understand there's a method to my madness, so to speak. I'm putting these things together, okay? Psychopathy, a deep understanding of it and the characteristics, force versus violence, and an understanding of what the foundations of this country attempted to enshrine about the inherent right of defense. And there's a reason I'm doing it now. With all the things that are going on regarding false flag events, mass shootings, and then the justifications to try to take the ability of people to defend themselves, thus leaving them completely defenseless against tyrannical government. This needs to be understood now, not at some future point. We should already be at a level of understanding that someone like myself is at. And unfortunately, most people are not at that level of understanding. Here's how they drafted the Second Amendment into the Constitution. This is the exact text. A well-regulated militia, comma, being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, comma, shall not be infringed. Now, I personally think it's very clear right there, and there's no ambiguity about it whatsoever. But because it is written in this older form of English, as far as sentence structure is concerned, the connotation is not as clear as it could be in modern English. So I've suggested that if we wrote this today, I'm not saying we need to rewrite it. I think it stands on its own as it is. But if we were to attempt to get a better understanding of what was actually meant by the people who wrote this, we could very simply rearrange a couple of words. And I'm going to add a word, and I'm going to change a form of a verb, and that's it. I'm going to add one word, and I'm going to change the form of one of the verbs. The verb to be in the second phrase within the sentence, being necessary. I'm going to say is necessary. I'm changing the form of the verb to be from being to is. That's it. Okay, here's how we might write it in modern colloquial English. how we would speak today. Since a well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, the meaning is perfectly clear and unambiguous. Now, what did they mean by these terms? Since a well-regulated militia, capital M, militia, that's some grouping of people, isn't it? What is that entity? What is the militia? And they're saying it is necessary to the security of a free state of being. This capital S state doesn't just mean the state of Pennsylvania, the state of Rhode Island, the state of New York, the state of Delaware. That's not what we're talking about. The capital S state, just like the capital M militia and capital A arms, means the totality of something. Militia is not small m militia, one specific grouping of people in a specific isolated place. The word militia has a specific connotative meaning to it that is defined right in the sentence, later in the sentence, of who that group of people is. The word state is capitalized, meaning state of being, a state of life. So they're telling you that this well-regulated militia, capital M, is necessary to the preservation, the security of, the continuance of a free condition, a free state of existence. Meaning, if you don't maintain this inherent right, if you don't maintain this readiness to engage force if it is required, you will not maintain the state of freedom that we fought to put in place, to secure. The right of the people to keep and bear, meaning possess and brandish, to possess and carry arms. That doesn't just mean projectile weapons. That means any defensive weapon, capital A arms, anything that can be used to defend oneself shall not be infringed under no circumstances, period. Period, period, period. At the end of the word infringe. Nothing after it. Full stop, end of sentence. Shall not be infringed. Not shall not be infringed if people abuse this inherent right and then start using violence with arms. No. Shall not be infringed, period. That's it. It's absolute. And this is what people don't grasp, especially fearful little children. Fearful little punks who think they somehow have the right to disarm people from defending their physical body when someone is coming at them with violence. Imagine, there are people in the world that actually believe that bullshit. Okay? And let's just call it what it is out in the open. That's what it is. These are fearful little punk children. Who is the militia that is being talked about in the Second Amendment? It's not a particular group of people. It is the people. It is defined in the sentence. Since a well-regulated militia is necessary to securing freedom, to keeping us free, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, because the people are the militia. Able-bodied citizens who can pick up a arm, a form of arms, a weapon, regardless of what it is, arms, capital A, and have a right to defend themselves with arms against the incursions of violence, you shall not infringe upon that right. The end. It is so cut and dried. It is so obvious. It is so unambiguous that you have to be a total ass to think that it is in some way ambiguous or to try to interpret it in a different way. Get as offended about that as you like. Say I'm harsh, I'm unyielding, I'm unapologetic, and you're absolutely damn right. So, I'm going to open up the phone lines now after having gone through that analysis of the Second Amendment to the Bill of Rights in the United States that was put forward for very specific reasons by people who were far more intelligent than the bulk of humanity is today and understood what was required to keep freedom and defend it from tyranny. And the question is going to be, ladies and gentlemen, whoever wants to call in, the call-in number is 866-841-1065, toll free, 866-841-1065. The question is, were the actions of the people who waged the Revolutionary War in this country against the British and their mercenaries conducting acts of love or acts of hate? And why do you think so either way? That is the question for the rest of the show today. So let's go to the phone lines, and that is what we're doing. If you're on the phone, that's the question I'm taking here. The other topics right now are set to the back burner. We are talking about the question of, I would say, if someone wants to comment on psychopathy, that's connected with this topic, so I'll take calls on that as well. But what I want each caller to do, if they are willing, is to say whether they think the actions of those who waged the Revolutionary War in the United States against the British and their mercenaries were engaging in acts of love or acts of hate, and why they think so. So let's go to the phones. Here we go. Emily from Pittsburgh, you are live on What on Earth is Happening. Welcome, and what do you have for us?
Hi. I was actually just listening.
Okay, no problem.
But I am enjoying. I am enjoying the show. I think it's an interesting topic.
Great.
Just to kind of like answer.
If you would like to chime in on that while I have you on the line, you are welcome. But if you're simply listening, don't feel compelled that you have to do so. I don't want to make you feel uncomfortable. But if you want to go ahead and chime in on that question, you're more than welcome to do so.
Okay. I mean, I would think it was like an act of love simply because, I mean, it's like you're fighting for your freedom. You know what I mean?
I do.
I think that, you know, it would be classified as an act of love, not like an act of aggression.
Now, let me ask you a question. You went toward the side that it was an act of love. I'm in full concurrence with that. I agree with you completely. But let's look at what they had to do. They actually had to kill other people. They had to pick up arms and snuff out other people's lives in order to secure that freedom. Like, would you consider that hateful acts?
Well,
I'm just trying to play the devil's advocate here. I could give you my answer to that and why I think it's one way or another. But, I'm just interested in what some of the callers think about this. So, the British were coming over here to try to continue their reign over the people. They sent their mercenaries and their armies to collect whatever oppressive taxation to stop them from using colonial script, to coerce and regulate the trade that they were engaged in, and ultimately to basically tell them how they had to live here. And it started turning into these psychopathic British soldiers that were stationed here looked at it as, well, this is an open field day. And, since the king has our back and, the king is God on earth, we're just going to start raping their women, taking whatever we have because we feel like it, setting up our shop in their house, doing whatever we want, and they'll just sit and take it. They'll take it endlessly because, after all, the king is God, And that's the kind of behavior that was started to be engaged in by these psychopathic lunatics called the British soldiers and their mercenaries. So I go back to the original question that I posed. You say it was an act of love. Many people, might have ambiguity about that because they'll say, well, they picked up weapons and actually fired weapons, or thrust bayonets into other people, fired muskets and bullets and killed people. They actually snuffed out other human lives. How could you say that that was an act of love? So how would you frame that? If your answer is that it is an act of love, it is an act of love. It entailed some very brutal things that they felt needed to be done. So, comment on that.
Well, I think that, like, in that entire situation, a lot of stuff was happening to lead up to, that confrontation. It wasn't just kind of some type of, flippant decision,
sure,
made overnight or anything like that. It
That's
was,
right.
You kept being pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed
Yep.
until you have to decide, it's me or them. You know what I mean? And I think that anybody can, relate to, like, a situation where if you have been pushed that far and you have to make, tough decisions. It doesn't have to be like maybe violent decisions, but you can connect that to, any type of difficult situation where you just cannot allow something to continue anymore.
Yes. Why? What I'm trying to get at is their action can only be based in love if it was based in right. An action cannot be based in love if it is based in a wrong. So when I'm talking about that they were killing, were they killing within their right to take a life? Is there such thing as a right to kill or a right to take a life? I would suggest that there is. There is never a right to murder. No such thing. Doesn't exist. Murder is always wrong because murder is the initiation of killing someone when you had no right. When there was no incursive act of initiatory aggression against you. But if there is an initiatory act of aggression against your body or against your rights, that is an act of violence, and you have an inherent right to respond to that violence with an act of force. So, in other words, the people who waged the Revolutionary War were not engaged in violent behavior. The British and their mercenaries were engaged in the violence because they were initiating the force. The revolutionaries were responding to the force. They were responding to the violence, with force. And that resulted in the taking of life because the aggressors would not discontinue their immoral behavior, which is an initiation of violence. They had no right. The British had no right to do what they were doing. They were in the wrong. There is a right and a wrong. And all that matters is who started it. Did we start the attack during the Revolutionary War? We did not.
No.
The British were here and refusing to leave people alone and exist in their right. We responded to that with force. Now, you could say, what is America doing today? America is waging wars of aggression, preemptive aggression against nations that did not attack us. They are not over here waging aggression. Okay? And yet we're waging aggression over there. The roles are reversed. We are the modern day British Army and mercenaries waging war in other countries because ultimately you have to understand that that regime never fully went out of control. They infiltrated their way back in, and the British Empire still ultimately runs this country and the world, along with other institutions, psychopathic and occult institutions. But ultimately, what I'm trying to get at is, if the act is based in love, it has to be based in right, which means it could not have been an act of violence. It was an act of defensive force. So I thank you for your your take on that and your contribution to answering that question. And go ahead. If you have something else, go ahead.
I did want to add that I do kind of disagree with, like, just kind of going back earlier, like in the show, with like the idea that psychopathy, like being a psychopath or whatever, is like intrinsic to people. I don't think that it's like a genetic thing. I think that people just use that so flippantly and you know, without really understanding genetics or how that works.
The vast majority of people who suffer from psychopathy are not primary psychopaths. We have to understand psychopathy is not one thing. It is two things.
Right, that's true.
Right. There is primary psychopathy and secondary psychopathy. What you're referring to as not being an inherent condition in a small, tiny portion that expresses that genetic disorder is called secondary psychopathy. The vast majority of people who suffer from psychopathy, you are absolutely correct. It is not genetic in its origin. It is not an inherent condition, and it can be changed with enough work. But there is also another kind of psychopath among us, the primary psychopath. So this is where the distinction comes in. And what I would suggest is you need not only to look into human genetics and the human genome, but you really need to look into the difference between primary and secondary psychopathy. I would suggest that there is such a thing as primary psychopathy, but it is an infinitely small number in comparison to the whole of the human population. Certainly much smaller, much smaller than the amount of the population that suffers from secondary psychopathy. So that's what I would encourage you to do, is to look into the difference between primary and secondary psychopathy and to understand that there is such a thing as a difference between those two forms of psychopathy. But as far as secondary psychopathy is concerned, I'm in complete agreement with you. It is curable. There is things that can be done to mitigate it or reverse it if enough will and effort is applied, not only by the person who's suffering from it, but by the community of people around him. Primary psychopathy, though, I cannot argue that. I cannot tell you that it is in any way fixable, curable, not at least with the technology that we have now. I do not believe that it is.
Well, what I'm thinking is that I was actually thinking about like a study that was done that came out of Sweden probably like 25 years ago. It's like not a very well-known study or anything like that, but it did show something interesting in like human connections to, you know, different animal populations, and they found that, you know, human babies when they're born, they're like baby birds. They imprint on, you know, the first thing that they, you know, see. Like, so whenever they open their eyes right after they're born, that's what, you know, they relate to. And I think that just because we live in such, you know, medicalized society, you know, just having like babies born in just this highly medicalized, non-feeling, non-human type of situation, I think that actually breeds that type of madness rather than
kind of trauma can initiate it right at the situation of birth.
Right.
Yeah, it's very possible. You know, and I say at birth. You know, I don't mean it's a, you know, destroyed soul, you know, coming into incarnation from its very inception. You know, there are conditions, I talked about this briefly last week, that possibly created in the womb and possibly birth trauma. Possible birth trauma. But again, you know, we're kind of splitting hairs by saying, well, it's conditions created at birth. Therefore, the person is like that from the time that they were born. Maybe, I'm open-minded to the possibility that maybe if we completely changed the environmental conditions that are actually giving form to the human being during the whole gestation period and birth, maybe we wouldn't have primary psychopathy. It's possible. It's possible. You know, I tend to look at it more that it is a genetic disorder that is inherent to the human genome. And there's reasons I have for looking at it more along those lines, which I'll get into on future shows. But but for now, I will say I'm open to the possibility of that what you're saying may be possible, that maybe it is also conditions prenatal in the womb or right at the time of birth. That's very possible. I'm not closed-minded to those possibilities. I happen to think that the answer to primary psychopathy lies elsewhere, but I'm not totally closed to looking at that potentiality as to why it exists, or at least exists in the prevalence that it does. So thanks for those comments. I'm going to
okay, thanks.
Thanks so much,
sorry?
Emily. Yes.
Oh yeah, I was just saying thanks, and I did enjoy the show.
Absolutely. Thank you for the call. All right, I'm going to go to, and I'll leave you on the line since you're listening by phone. Okay. I'm going to go to another caller now. Let's move on to Ivan in Phoenix. You're live on What on Earth is Happening. Welcome.
Hi, Mark. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. You sound good. Coming in loud and clear.
Oh, okay. Well, I kind of already answered your question last week, and right in the middle of it, I guess you kind of changed my mind and woke me up that you're right. It is out of love. And the violence that comes of it, it's kind of, I would compare it to like if you're in your home with your family and some terrorist or somebody comes in with like a grenade, are you going to just stay in there and let it blow up and everybody get killed? Or are you going to try and like force the guy out, of your home, and doing so you get blown up with him? So it's bloody and very disgusting and nobody wants to see it. But that was an act of love.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. See, it's all about defense. We're not talking about aggression. Aggression and defense are two different things. One implies that you are initiating the force. Therefore, it's violent behavior. That's what aggression is. Defense is retaliatory or responsive force that is used to counter violence. So, again, when people say you don't respond to violence with violence, that's a wrong way of looking at it. You're never going to respond to violence with violence. If violence is initiated, the response is in force, not in violence. This is what people have to understand. And I'm not just suggesting, a total ideology of vengeance, of an eye for an eye necessarily. I'm saying if someone is coming at you in the moment, attacking you and aggressing against you with violence, you have every right to use whatever amount of defensive force is required to put down that act of aggression in the moment. And,
Right, I agree.
The problem is people never look at what's going on in the totality, in the aggregate of how our rights are being usurped and violated as acts of violence that are current and ongoing. But indeed, that is what's going on. We are under violence and threat of violence daily, on a daily basis. Just the fact that something called a property tax exists is violence. That means you are existing in a constant level of the threat of violence. Because if you don't pay your tribute to the master who is claiming ownership of your land and house, then they can come and physically, with violence, they're saying we have a right to put you out of your home and make you homeless. And people don't even conceive that this is what all property taxes are. This is what all taxation is. Another example I gave, Ivan, let me give you this example, right? I ask people, would you categorize the sport of boxing as violent? Would you describe boxing as a violent sport? Yes or no?
Now you kind of have me trapped. I don't know whether to say yes or no. It involves violence. Yes, it involves violence because of the blood and all that, but it's also athletic skills.
Let me jump in for one moment, okay, to try to clarify. I want you to just give your instinctive gut response. Like, don't overthink it at first. What would you ordinarily say to that question? Is boxing violent? Yes or no? Gut, right away.
No.
Okay. Why?
Well, because I looked at it from maybe, I don't want to say artistic, but sporting, because you have to think strategy, whether it hit the body to weaken it and stuff like that.
You appreciate the strategy involved and things like that, but that's not what makes it not violent. I want to know why it isn't violent. You're correct. Boxing is not a violent sport. And the people hear that, and it sounds so strange when they hear it. But if you really understand the difference between force and violence, you'll understand that that's absolutely true. But why
That's right. Now I understand what you're saying, because you're not violating anybody's right. There's no violence involved, because both of you are participating consensual. I'm going to let you hit me. I'm going to let you hit me because you're going to let me hit you, and then both of you go at it.
It is a contest of strength or active power, or a contest of force that is engaged in consensually. And there is why it is not a violent sport. It is a forceful sport. It is a competition of force. But in the definition, see, this is mind control, ladies and gentlemen. I want you to really pay attention to this. Mind control works through the obfuscation of the definitions of words. When people don't understand the meanings of the words that they are speaking, they could be made to think anything. They could be manipulated to think anything. That's how mind control works, through words.
Are you saying, Mark, I was a little bit mind controlled there?
Oh, no, I'm saying you passed the test. That in that respect, you're not under mind control. You get the distinction and the